Victoria Valentina slammed her hand on the hood of a $1.5 million Ferrari and screamed at her lead engineer, "I don't care what your computer says, fix it, or you're finished." The entire showroom went silent. 200 guests in designer gowns and tailored suits froze mid-conversation. Champagne glasses stopped moving. Because no one, not a single person in that room, had ever seen Victoria Valentina break. Until tonight. And the man who would shatter everything she believed about talent, class, and who deserves to be seen. He was standing 40 feet away, mop in hand, watching the whole thing unfold. If you're watching this from somewhere out there, drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button because you do not want to miss where this goes. The invitation said 8 o'clock. By 7:30, the elevator doors at Valentina Motors' Manhattan showroom were already opening every 90 seconds, releasing a steady stream of the kind of people who don't wait in lines, don't carry their own bags, and don't, under any circumstances, acknowledge the men who clean the floors they walk on. Daniel Carter noticed them, the way he noticed everything, quietly, without making a sound. He was pushing a utility cart along the service corridor on the building's lower level, the rubber wheels squeaking softly against polished concrete when the first of the limousines pulled up outside. He didn't stop to look. He'd worked in this building for 14 months. And in those 14 months, he had learned exactly how much space he was supposed to take up. Not much. He turned the cart toward the supply closet at the far end of the hall and got back to work. Upstairs, the Valentina Motors annual charity gala was supposed to be the kind of night people remembered for the rest of their lives. Not because of the champagne, though there was plenty of it, the expensive kind that costs more per bottle than Daniel earned in a week. Not because of the guest list, though it read like a directory of everyone who mattered in New York's financial and automotive world. No. Tonight was supposed to be remembered for one reason, and one reason only. The car. It sat in the center of the showroom like a monument. A Ferrari SF90 Stradale, custom-built hybrid prototype, painted in a shade of red so deep it looked almost black under the showroom lights. $1.5 million of precision engineering. The only one of its kind in the world. And it was Victoria Valentina's. She had spent 3 years working toward this moment. 3 years of negotiation with Ferrari's engineering division in Maranello. 3 years of designing the custom hybrid system that she believed would change the direction of luxury automotive technology. 3 years of building toward a single night, a single unveiling, that would prove to every investor, every journalist, every competitor who had ever doubted her, that Victoria Valentina was not just her father's daughter. She was better. She was standing near the car when Marcus Hale found her. Marcus was the kind of man who had spent so much time around machines that he'd started to move like one deliberate, unhurried, precise. He'd been the head mechanic at Valentina Motors for 11 years. He was 62 years old and had worked on vehicles that most people only ever saw in magazines. He was also, at this particular moment, the person responsible for telling Victoria something she was not going to want to hear. Victoria. She turned. She was wearing a black dress that cost more than most people's rent, and her dark hair was pulled back in a way that made her look like she was perpetually in the middle of a board meeting, which in a sense she always was. She saw his face, and she knew. "Tell me you're joking," she said. "I've never joked in 11 years, Marcus said. "The car won't start." The silence between them lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Victoria grabbed his arm and walked toward the back of the showroom, away from the staff arranging canapes and the security team running ear-pit checks. "Since when?" she asked. "We noticed it at 2 this afternoon. It was running fine this morning, during the final check. Sometime between noon and 2, something changed. We've been on it for 6 hours, Marcus." "Yes." And he paused. "The diagnostics say everything is perfect. Every system reads normal. Batteries at full charge, the hybrid controller is responding. The ECU shows 0 error codes." He stopped. "But when we turn the key, nothing happens. The car just doesn't start." Victoria stared at him. "That is not possible," she said. "I know. A car either starts or it doesn't start. There is a reason. There is always a reason." "I know," Marcus said again. "We haven't found it yet." Victoria turned away from him and looked at the room. The guests were arriving in greater numbers now. She could see Giorgio Ferrante near the bar, the head of Ferrante Capital, whose investment in her company had made this prototype possible. She could see Christina Park, from Autovision magazine, digital recorder already in her breast pocket. She could see Judge Harold Whitmore and his wife Eleanor, retired now. But Eleanor had spent 40 years as a consultant to Ferrari's North American division and knew more about these cars than anyone else in the building. 200 people. 200 powerful, influential, deeply connected people. All of them here to watch Victoria Valentina present a car that was currently refusing to function. She turned back to Marcus. "Get every engineer you have in that back room," she said. Her voice was very quiet, which was always worse than when she yelled. "I don't care what it takes. I want this car running before I take that podium at 9 o'clock. "Are we clear, Crystal?" Marcus said. He walked away quickly. Victoria put her hand on the Ferrari's hood, very gently, the way you might touch something you loved and were terrified of losing. Then she straightened up, smiled at a passing couple who waved at her, and went to greet her guests. By 8:15, the engineering team had replaced 2 separate battery management units. The car still didn't start. By 8:30, they had run a full diagnostic sweep 3 separate times, checked every sensor in the hybrid control system, and replaced the primary ECU board with a backup unit they'd driven in from their Hoboken facility. Nothing. By 8:45, Victoria was no longer touching people's arms when she spoke to them. She was standing at the edge of conversations with a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, smiling at the right moments, laughing at the right jokes, while her mind was entirely in the back room, with 6 engineers who were failing her. She excused herself at 8:50 and walked to the service entrance. The back room smelled like electrical burn and anxiety. 6 of her best people were hunched over laptops and diagnostic tablets, cables wrenching from their equipment into the Ferrari's computer system like an intensive care unit that had run out of ideas. "Talk to me," Victoria said. Her lead engineer, a 31-year-old named Jason, who had graduated top of his class from MIT and never let anyone forget it, looked up from his screen. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen before, in 2 years of working with him. He was scared. "Victoria, don't tell me you don't know," she said. "Don't say those words to me right now." "I don't have an answer yet," he said. "Everything reads clean. Every system is functioning exactly as it should. On paper, this car should start. We've replaced the parts most likely to cause a no-start condition. The fault isn't showing up anywhere." She looked at him for a long time. "You have 10 minutes, she said. "After that, I'm going to have to stand at that podium and tell 200 guests that the centerpiece of this evening is decorative." She walked out. Daniel heard them before he saw them. He was in the service corridor, just outside the maintenance access door that connected to the showroom's rear staging area, a door that was, technically, not supposed to be used by building maintenance during private events. But the circuit breaker panel for the corridor lighting was behind that door, and one of the fluorescent fixtures in the hallway outside had been flickering all evening. And Daniel had a responsibility to the building he worked in that he took seriously, regardless of what was happening on the other side of the wall. He pulled out his access card, ran it through the reader, and stepped inside. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't trying to see the Ferrari. He was looking for a flickering light fixture and the breaker that was causing it. But then he stopped, because something was wrong. He couldn't explain it in words that would have meant anything to Jason and his MIT degree. He couldn't have pulled up a diagnostic screen and pointed to an error code. What Daniel Carter had was something different, something that had been built into him over 20 years of working on machines in a garage outside Detroit, with his father, in the dark, with tools that cost less than the cables Jason was using tonight. He could hear the car. Not the engine wasn't running. What he could hear was the electrical system cycling, the quiet but persistent attempt and fail pattern of a system trying to complete a connection that kept breaking at the last microsecond. He knew that sound, the way a doctor knows the sound of a heartbeat that's slightly off rhythm. You couldn't put it on a chart. You just knew. He stood there for about 30 seconds, listening. Then he took a breath and walked toward the engineers. "Excuse me," he said. Jason looked up. Several other engineers looked up. They all registered the same thing at the same moment: work boots, worn uniform, building maintenance badge. "The staff entrance is back the way you came," Jason said, and turned back to his screen. "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not here about the event. I think I might know what's wrong with the car." The room went very still. One of the junior engineers actually laughed. Not mindly, just reflexively. The way you laugh when something is so surprising, it catches you off guard. Jason swiveled his chair around and looked at Daniel with an expression that was trying hard to be patient. "We appreciate that," he said, in the tone of someone who did not appreciate it at all. "But this is a proprietary hybrid system that requires specialized diagnostic software. And the computer's not going to find it," Daniel said. Jason blinked. "The fault pattern doesn't stay open long enough for your software to log it," Daniel continued. He was speaking carefully, not aggressively, choosing his words the way you choose your steps, on uncertain ground. "Whatever's breaking the circuit is doing it in milliseconds. The system recognizes it as a safety event and shuts down. But by the time the shutdown completes and the log writes, the fault is already gone. Your diagnostics are clean because they're only reading the recovery state, not the failure event." Silence. Jason stared at him. "He started. "Who are you?" said a different voice. Daniel turned. He hadn't heard Victoria come back in. She was standing in the doorway, still holding the untouched champagne glass, looking at him with an expression that went through several stages. Very quickly surprise, confusion, and then something that settled into something harder. "I'm the maintenance tech for the building," Daniel said. "Daniel Carter." Victoria looked at Jason. Jason gave her a slight shrug that said, "I don't know what to tell you." She looked back at Daniel. Her eyes went down work boots, uniform, maintenance badge, and came back up. Something shifted in her expression. "You heard what my engineer just said," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes. Then you understand this is a custom Ferrari hybrid prototype worth $1.5 million. Not exactly a typical maintenance call." "No, ma'am," Daniel said. "It's not." "So what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting the problem is in the hybrid safety connection. Probably a grounding pin in the high-voltage junction interface. Something that looks seated, but isn't not completely. It's passing visual inspection, and it's passing the initial diagnostic contact test. But under the vibration of the startup cycle, the connection breaks for just long enough to trigger the safety shutdown. Then it resets itself, and your computer says everything is fine." Victoria was quiet for a moment. Then she said Marcus. Marcus had been standing near the back wall. He stepped forward. "Have you checked the HV junction interface pins?" she asked him. Marcus looked at Daniel, then at Victoria. "Not individually. The system read the junction as clean," Daniel said. "I know, because the pin looks correct in the static test. You have to feel it under startup load conditions." Marcus was quiet, and Daniel noticed something change in the older mechanic's eyes. Not conversion, not yet, but interest. The particular kind of interest that comes from someone who knows enough to recognize when another person might actually know what they're talking about. "You can feel a high-voltage junction fault?" Marcus asked. "My father could," Daniel said. "He taught me." The room was quiet. Victoria set her champagne glass down on the nearest flat surface. "Go get Jordan," she told Jason. "Tell him I need the HV safety connector access panel open in the next 3 minutes." Jason moved immediately. Daniel started to step back, out of the way, because he understood that this was not his space, and he had said what he came to say, and now his job was to be invisible again. "Wait," Victoria said. He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. "Come with me," she said. He followed her out of the back room, through the staging area, and into the showroom itself. And that was the moment Daniel Carter understood what he had walked into. The room was full. Not just full-filled, the way a concert hall is filled. Every inch of available space occupied by the kind of presence that money and power generate. Crystal chandeliers, white linen, the soft layered sound of 200 conversations happening simultaneously, punctuated by laughter, and the quiet clink of glasses. And in the center of it all, the Ferrari. Even from across the room, even knowing it wasn't running, it looked like it was moving, like it was barely staying still out of courtesy. Daniel stopped walking. Victoria turned and saw his face. "Something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. He was looking at the car. "I just didn't expect." He stopped himself. "Never mind. I'm sorry. Where do you want me?" She studied him for a moment. "Near the car. I want you close in case." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Near the car meant near the guests. And the guests, almost immediately, noticed them. It started with a look. The kind of look that doesn't mean to be cruel but is. The eyes that travel from face to clothing in under a second and draw conclusions that take years to undo. Daniel felt it from 3 different directions. Before he'd taken 5 steps toward the Ferrari, he kept his posture straight and his eyes level and his expression neutral, because he had learned a long time ago that the only response to being looked through was to keep moving. He reached the Ferrari and crouched beside the front driver's side wheel, listening again. Is he part of the presentation? He heard a woman's voice nearby, not directed at him, directed at whoever she was standing next to. "He's in a maintenance uniform." "I don't know," said a man's voice. Victoria brought him over. Daniel ignored it. He was listening to the car. The electrical system was still cycling, still trying, still failing at the last microsecond, and recovering, and trying again. There you are, he thought. The moment everything changed, happened in a way nobody in the room expected. Victoria had stepped away briefly to speak with Giorgio Ferrante near the bar. Jordan, the junior engineer, had pulled the HV access panel and was crouched next to Daniel, going through the junction connectors one by one with a multimeter. Sophia, Victoria's head of media and communications, the one who handled the company's social accounts, was standing about 15 feet away with her phone out, because Sophia was always standing somewhere with her phone out. She had been filming what she thought was going to be a charming behind-the-scenes moment, the final pre-launch preparations. The kind of content that generated engagement. She caught Daniel on camera without intending to. And then Victoria came back and saw Daniel crouching beside the Ferrari, and the expression on her face when she looked at him. Sophia caught that too. What happened next, Sophia would later say, was something she didn't plan and would have handled differently if she'd had 5 more seconds to think about it. "Victoria," she said, stepping forward with her phone. "Do you want me to?" "Not now," Victoria said. But she was still looking at Daniel, and her expression was still complicated. Something in her that she would not have identified as cruelty, but that functioned as cruelty in the way that certainty about who deserves space and who doesn't always eventually functions as cruelty. "Does he actually work for us?" someone nearby said. Loud enough to carry. Not directed at Daniel but about him, which was somehow worse. Victoria said. "He's the building's maintenance worker." That sentence landed in the room, the way a rock lands in still water. The ripples went outward in every direction. Daniel heard it. He kept his eyes on the connector he was examining. The pin looked fine. It looked absolutely fine. But he could feel. And this was the thing that could not be put on a diagnostic screen, the thing that 20 years of working with his hands in a garage with his father had built into him. He could feel that it wasn't. "It's not locked," he thought. "It's seated, but it's not locked." "He thinks he knows what's wrong with it," another voice said. Someone closer to the situation. Someone who'd heard the earlier conversation. The maintenance guy. Laughter. Not universal, not everyone laughed. But enough people laughed that it became the sound of the room for a moment. Daniel's jaw tightened. One small movement, he controlled it. Victoria heard the laughter. And this is the thing she would spend time with later, the thing she would sit with, in the quiet of her office at 2 in the morning and not be able to make peace with. She didn't stop it. She let it go, because some part of her agreed with it. Some part of her had already decided what Daniel Carter was worth, based on the badge on his chest and the boots on his feet. She walked toward him. "Stop," she said. Daniel looked up. "I appreciate that you shared your theory," Victoria said. "But I have professionals handling this now. You should get back to mine." "I found it," Daniel said. The room shifted again. A different quality of silence this time. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. "The pin," Daniel pointed. "Right here. It looks seated. It's passing every static test you run, because in a static test it maintains contact. But the startup cycle creates vibration, not much, but enough. At a specific frequency, the pin loses contact for approximately 40 to 60 milliseconds. The safety system reads that as a high-voltage fault and cuts the startup sequence. The fault resolves before the log writes. So you get clean diagnostics in a car that won't start. He looked up at her. I can fix it, he said. 5 minutes. Victoria looked at him, and here was the moment. The actual moment. The one that the next several days would circle back to over and over. The one that the video, the Wolfa was still filming, without entirely realizing she was filming, would capture in a way that left nothing to interpretation. Victoria Valentina looked at Daniel Carter, crouched on the floor next to her, $1.5 million Ferrari, and she looked at his boots and his badge and his hands, especially his hands. Because Daniel's hands told a story that his uniform couldn't contain. But Victoria wasn't reading that story. And she said, "You clean this building," she said it simply, "without heat, which made it worse. You maintain the facilities. That is your job, and I'm grateful for that genuinely. But this is a proprietary hybrid system, developed in partnership with Ferrari's engineering division. You don't have the training, you don't have the credentials, and frankly," she stopped, looked at him steadily. "You don't have the background." The room was very quiet. Daniel held her gaze. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. His voice was level, not pleading, not angry, just even. 5 minutes, and I'll show you whether I'm right." Something flickered in Victoria's expression. For a moment, just a moment, something almost moved in her face that might have been uncertainty, or second-guessing, or the beginning of a question she should have asked, instead of the statement she made. It passed. "You want 5 minutes," she said. She turned, slightly, so that more of the room could hear her, and in that turning, Daniel understood what was about to happen. In front of 200 guests. "To prove that you, the building maintenance worker, can repair a Ferrari that my engineering team has been working on for 8 hours. "Yes," Daniel said. Victoria Valentina looked at the room. A slight smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Fine," she said. "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Carter. And when those 5 minutes are up, and the car is still exactly where it is right now, you will go back to whatever it is you were doing, and we won't speak of this again." She raised her voice slightly, addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have a volunteer." Some people laughed. Some people shifted uncomfortably. A few people moved closer because whatever was about to happen, it was clearly more interesting than the conversation they'd been having. Marcus Hale, who had been standing at the edge of the cluster of engineers, didn't move. He was watching Daniel's face, and what he saw in Daniel's face was not performance, was not bravado, was not the expression of a man trying to prove something to people who doubted him. It was focus, the kind of focus that comes from knowing exactly what you're about to do. Marcus had been a mechanic for 38 years. He had worked alongside people who were brilliant, and people who were frauds, and people who were frauds, and people who were somewhere in between, and in 38 years he had learned to tell the difference in about 40 seconds of watching someone work. He was at 40 seconds, and he was already moving toward the tool cart. Daniel stood up. He was aware of the room, 200 people, the cameras, the lights, Victoria standing to his left with her arms crossed, and her expression set in something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close enough to it that the difference didn't matter, and he put all of it aside. His father had taught him that too. The machine doesn't know who's watching, Daniel. It doesn't care about the audience. You give the machine your full attention, and you give the audience nothing, because the work is the only thing that's real. He looked at the Ferrari. "Marcus," he said, "can I get a tension gauge and a micro-torque driver?" "Jeweler's flathead if you have one." Marcus was already holding them out. Some of the engineers exchanged looks. Daniel crouched beside the HV junction access panel. "What's he doing?" Someone in the crowd asked. "He's not using the diagnostic system," said another voice, confused. "He's not using anything," said a third. "He's just looking at it." Daniel wasn't looking at it. He was feeling it. His right hand moved along the wiring harness with a slowness that looked almost ceremonial, fingers reading the assembly the way a musician reads a score, not just seeing the notes but feeling the rhythm underneath them. He stopped. Right there, pin 7 in the high-voltage safety junction array, seated perfectly. Looked completely correct to every inspection protocol in the engineering manual. Daniel pressed his thumb against the side of the connector housing and felt it. That microscopic play, That infinitesimal give that shouldn't be there. There you are. This pin, he said, not to Victoria, not to the crowd, just to Marcus, who was crouching beside him now. Feel the housing. Marcus put his hand where Daniel indicated. A pause. Then Marcus said very quietly, "Son of a gun." Daniel took the micro-torque driver. He worked carefully, without rushing, because rushing was for people who didn't know what they were doing. He reseated the connector and applied the correct torque specification, not from a manual, from memory. Then added a secondary grounding bridge to the adjacent terminal point, which would maintain the circuit integrity under vibration conditions even if the primary connection developed play again. It took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. He stood up. He looked at Victoria. "Try starting it," he said. Victoria stared at him. Whatever she'd expected from the 5 minutes business, embarrassment, failure, confirmation of what she already believed, she had not expected the absolute, unadorned certainty in his voice. She turned to one of her engineers. "Get in the car." Jordan slid into the driver's seat, hands on the wheel. Key in position. He looked at Victoria. She nodded. He turned the key, and the Ferrari SF90 Stradale, the $1.5 million masterpiece that had refused to run for 8 hours, that had defeated 6 engineers with advanced degrees and diagnostics systems worth more than Daniel's apartment, came alive. The sound was extraordinary, even in a showroom, even without the road beneath it. The engine spoke with an authority that hit people physically in the chest, behind the sternum, the way great things do when they finally stop being silent. The sound filled every corner of the room, and then the room itself went quiet. Not the silence of discomfort or confusion. Something else. The particular silence that falls when 200 people simultaneously confront the distance between what they assumed and what is actually true. Victoria Valentina stood in the center of that silence, and she did not move for a very long time. Daniel Carter wiped his hands on his work cloth, folded it and put it in his back pocket. He looked at the Ferrari not with pride, not with triumph, just with something quiet and almost tender, the way you look at something you have understood and helped. And then he looked at Marcus. Marcus was nodding slowly, just nodding, the way an old man nods when something confirms what he hoped was true. "Your father teach you to build that grounding bridge?" Marcus asked. "He taught me why you need one," Daniel said. "The rest is just geometry." Marcus almost smiled. Around them, the silence was beginning to break, not into laughter now, not into the casual dismissal of minutes ago, but into something stranger and more uncertain. The sound of 200 people recalibrating, the sound of a room trying to decide what to do with what it just witnessed. And somewhere near the edge of that crowd, Sophia was still holding her phone, still filming, still standing exactly where she'd been standing when all of this started. The camera had caught everything, every word, every look, every second of those 4 minutes and 11 seconds. And the moment the engine came to life, and the expression on Victoria Valentina's face, in the exact instant she understood what she had, not just tonight, but in every conversations she'd ever had with someone she'd decided, without evidence, didn't belong in the room. The video was 47 seconds long. Sophia would not post it tonight, but she would post it. And when she did, the world would see Daniel Carter the way Marcus had seen him from the beginning. Not the maintenance worker, not the building staff, not the man in the worn boots that Victoria had looked past. The man who heard what no one else could hear. The man who found what no one else could find. The man whose father had given him something that no credential, no degree, no company name on a business card had ever been able to replicate. The truth of his work. And tonight, in a Manhattan showroom full of the most powerful people in the automotive world, the truth had been loud enough for everyone to hear, even the people who hadn't been listening. His daughter was asleep when he got home that night. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long time, watching her breathe. He didn't wake her. He didn't need to. Some things you carry alone, the weight of a room full of people looking through you, and the quiet satisfaction of reminding yourself that what they see is not what you are. He thought about his father. He thought about the garage. He turned off the hallway light and went to bed. Tomorrow was another day of work. But tonight, something had changed. He just didn't know yet how much. The engine was still running. That was the thing nobody knew how to process. The Ferrari was sitting right there in the center of the showroom, running, alive, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and nobody was talking. 200 people who had not stopped talking since they walked through the door were standing in something close to silence, and the only sound filling that room was the low, authoritative idle of an engine that 47 minutes ago had been, by all available evidence, dead. Daniel had already stepped back. He'd moved away from the car the way he always moved away from a finished job, quietly, without ceremony, without waiting to see if anyone noticed. That was habit. That was 14 months of being the man in the building that people look through instead of at. You finish your work, you step back, you make yourself small again, and you move on. But the room wouldn't let him disappear this time. He felt it before he understood it, a shift in the air. The way 200 people turning to look at the same thing changes the pressure in a space. He was 3 steps from the edge of the crowd when he realized that what they were turning to look at was not the Ferrari. It was him. He stopped walking. Victoria Valentina had not moved. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing. When Jordan turned the key 6 feet from the drive-outside door, arms that had been crossed now at her sides, champagne glass sitting forgotten on a display pedestal 10 feet behind her. Her expression was doing something complicated. The certainty that had been there all evening. The settled, unquestioned authority of a woman who had never once doubted that she was the most capable person in any room she entered. That expression was still there. But it had cracked somewhere in the middle, and the crack was visible. She was looking at Daniel, and Daniel was looking at her, and neither of them spoke. It was Marcus who broke it. Not with words. Marcus rarely used words when something more direct was available. He started clapping. One pair of hands in a silent room sounds like something between applause and a heartbeat. Slow and deliberate, and Marcus's hands were large and calloused, and when they came together, the sound was unmistakable. He was looking at Daniel when he did it, not at Victoria, not at the Ferrari, not at the crowd. At Daniel. One person joined him, then 3 more. Then the sound built from the edges of the crowd inward. Uneven at first, tentative, the kind of applauses that starts because people aren't sure yet what they're applauding, but they know they're supposed to be doing something with their hands. Then Giorgio Ferrante started clapping, and Giorgio Ferrante's opinion was the closest thing this room had to a weather system. And within 15 seconds, the applause was real. Daniel stood in the middle of it and did not know what to do with his hands. He settled for holding them at his sides. He didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just stood there, in his worn uniform, with his maintenance badge still clipped to his chest, and let the sound wash over him, and thought about his father who would have told him to get back to the circuit breaker panel and find that flickering light. His father, who would have said, on the drive home, with the kind of quietness that meant he was actually proud, "You did good, son. You did the work. That's all it ever is." Daniel blinked. He was not going to do this here, not in front of 200 people, not with cameras pointed at him. He turned back toward the service corridor. "Mr. Carter." The voice was clear and direct, and it cut through the applause without effort. Not because it was loud. Victoria Valentina had spent 20 years learning that you don't have to raise your voice when you own the room. You just have to believe that what you're saying deserves to be heard. He turned. She was walking toward him. The crowd parted for her automatically, the way it always did, but her attention was entirely on Daniel, and the crowd seemed to understand that whatever was happening right now was not for them. She stopped 4 feet in front of him. Up close, the crack in her expression was more visible. Something working behind her eyes that she wasn't entirely in control of, which was, Daniel sensed, not a condition she was accustomed to. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Back to work," he said. "There's a circuit breaker in the east corridor that needs attention." Something moved across her face, almost like a flinch. "The circuit breaker." "Yes, ma'am." She stared at him for a long moment. Around them the applause had faded, but the attention of the room had not. 200 people were watching this conversation, with the focused intensity of people who understand they are witnessing something that matters, even if they can't yet name what it is. "You're not," she stopped. Started again. "You don't have to leave." "I know," Daniel said, "but I've got a job to do." He held her gaze for exactly 1 second. Then he turned and walked toward the service corridor. He did not look back. Behind him, he heard Victoria say something he couldn't make out, and he heard Marcus respond. And then the room began to fill with sound again conversation. The eventual return of the event's momentum. The slow reassembling of an evening that had been knocked sideways for 7 minutes. But it was not the same room it had been before. Some things, once they happen, cannot unhappen. And what had happened in this room tonight had the particular quality of something that changes the shape of everything that comes after it, even if nobody can say exactly how. Daniel pushed through the service door, and for the first time since he'd walked into that showroom, he let himself breathe. He found the flickering light in under 3 minutes. Bad connection on the ballast driver, not complicated, fixable, in about 8 minutes with the right tool, which Daniel had on his cart. He worked in the quiet of the corridor, with the methodical focus that was as natural to him as breathing, and while he worked, he did not think about the Ferrari or the crowd or Victoria Valentina's expression in the moment the engine came alive. He thought about Emma. His daughter was 9 years old, and she had the habit of leaving her shoes in the middle of the hallway, and she could not fall asleep without at least one story. And 3 weeks ago she had lost a tooth and cried about it for 20 minutes because she was convinced the tooth fairy wasn't real. And losing the tooth just proved it. And Daniel had sat on the edge of her bed at 10:30 at night after a full shift and told her a story about a tooth fairy who was real but very busy and sometimes ran late. And Emma had fallen asleep halfway through, and he had sat there in the dark watching her breathe and feeling the particular weight of being the only person standing between his child and a world that didn't particularly care whether she was okay. Emma needed new shoes. The ones she had were getting tight, she'd told him 2 weeks ago. And he'd said soon, sweetheart. Soon, and soon meant the next paycheck, after the one that covered rent, which put it somewhere in the middle of next month, if nothing unexpected came up. He finished with the ballast driver. The light stopped flickering. He pushed his cart toward the service elevator. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it. A number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail and kept walking. It buzzed again. Same number. He stopped the cart and answered. Daniel Carter? The voice was professional. A woman's voice, composed. The kind of voice that belonged to someone whose job was to not be surprised by anything. Speaking, Daniel said. My name is Renata Cruz. I'm the personal assistant to Dr. Eleanor Whitmore. Dr. Whitmore would like to speak with you this evening, if possible. She's currently at the Valentina Motors Gala. Daniel was quiet for a moment. How did you get this number, he asked. A brief pause. Marcus Hale provided it. Of course he did. Daniel almost smiled. What does Dr. Whitmore want to speak with me about? She didn't say, Renata said. But she asked me to tell you that she's been watching automotive engineering for 40 years, and tonight is the first time in a long time that she's seen something genuinely new. Daniel stood in the service corridor with his cart and his tools and his maintenance badge, and let that sentence sit for a moment. I'll be up in 10 minutes, he said. He changed his shirt in the maintenance locker room. He didn't have anything better. His only clean shirt was the spare work shirt. He kept it in his locker for double shifts. But it was cleaner than the one he'd been wearing. And he tucked it in properly and ran water through his hair and looked at himself in the mirror, above the sink for about 4 seconds. He looked like what he was. He went upstairs. The gala was in a different phase. Now the Ferrari was running. The crisis had resolved. And the event had pivoted back toward its original purpose with the resilient momentum that expensive parties always find when the right people decide to stop being derailed. Jordan had parked the car in its display position, with the engine idling, and several guests had gathered around it in the appreciative way people gather around things they cannot afford, and the bar was doing a brisk business. Daniel moved through the edge of the crowd and found Marcus near the engineering station at the back of the room. Dr. Whitmore, Daniel said. Where is she? Marcus tilted his head toward a seating area near the far window. She's been there for 20 minutes, waiting for you. She doesn't wait for people, generally speaking. Just so you know. What's she like? 74 years old. Retired Ferrari technical consultant. Holds 3 patents in hybrid safety systems. Doesn't suffer fools. Marcus looked at him steadily. You won't be a fool in her eyes. But she'll ask you hard questions. And she'll know the difference between an answer and a performance. I'm not a performer, Daniel said. I know, Marcus said. That's why I gave her your number. Daniel looked at him for a moment. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Marcus said. He almost smiled again. It was becoming a habit. Go, doctor. Eleanor Whitmore was a small woman with white hair, cut short and eyes so dark and direct that looking in to them felt like being read, not just seen, but actually read like a document being processed. She was sitting in a chair with the particular stillness of who has stopped performing relaxation and simply is relaxed, and she watched Daniel walk toward her with an expression of calm, of focused attention. He reached her and held out his hand. Dr. Whitmore. Daniel Carter. She shook it firmly. Sit down, Daniel. He sat. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she said, How old are you? 34. How long have you been working on cars? Since I was about 12. My father had a repair garage outside Detroit. What kind of cars? Whatever came in. American classics mostly in the beginning. Mustangs, Chargers, Camaros. Some imports as we got a better reputation. My father had a gift for engines. People drove from a long way away. What kind of schooling do you have in automotive engineering? None, Daniel said formally. Whitmore nodded slowly. Tell me about tonight. Walk me through exactly what you did and why. He did. He described it, without embellishment, what he heard, what it told him, what he looked for, what he found, what he did to fix it, and why the secondary grounding bridge was necessary. Not just for tonight, but for the life of the system. He used technical language naturally, the way people use language they grew up with, and he watched Whitmore's face as he spoke, and her face was very attentive and gave away nothing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The diagnostic blind spot you identified, she said. The millisecond fault window that closes before the log writes. I want to understand how you knew to look for that without running a time domain analysis. Because the sound pattern was wrong, Daniel said. When a system is failing on a clean fault, a bad sensor, a dead cell, there's a consistent pattern to the attempt cycle. This was inconsistent. The intervals between attempts were changing. That told me the fault was intermittent, and that it was restoring itself, which meant the system was healthy enough to try, but something was interrupting the attempt. And if it was interrupting in a way the diagnostics weren't catching, the interruption had to be happening inside a window shorter than the log write cycle. Whitmore looked at him. My father used to say, Daniel continued, that machines talk in patterns. If you've heard enough patterns, you stop needing the readout. The readout just confirms what you already heard. A long pause. How many times, Whitmore said carefully, have you been passed over for engineering work because you don't have credentials? Daniel looked at her. More than I can count. What kind of work have you applied for? Mechanical diagnostic positions, mostly. One dealership supervisor position, 2 years ago. Couple of independent shop lead roles. He paused. I get past the application sometimes. I don't get past the interview when they see my resume. No degree. Whitmore nodded. Then she said, what my late husband used to say, and Harold was a federal judge for 31 years, so he had a great deal of experience watching people be wrong with tremendous confidence, was that credentials are a shorthand for competence. A useful shorthand, often, but a shorthand. And the danger with any shorthand is that it eventually stops being a tool for reading the room and becomes a substitute for reading the room. Daniel was quiet. Victoria Valentina, Whitmore said, is a brilliant woman. I have watched her build something genuinely extraordinary over the past decade. She is also, at this particular moment in her life, deeply in love with her shorthand. She's not wrong to use it, Daniel said. Most of the time, credentials mean something. Whitmore tilted her head slightly. You're defending her. I'm not defending what she said. I understand the logic. If I'd walked in there and been wrong, it would have been chaos. She had 200 people watching. She was protecting something that matters to her. She humiliated you in front of those 200 people, Whitmore said. Yes, Daniel said simply. She did. The simplicity of it hung in the air between them. Not with bitterness, not with self-pity, just as a fact. Whitmore studied him for a long moment. You have a daughter, she said. It wasn't a question, which meant Marcus had shared more than just the phone number. Emma, she's 9. What does she know about what you do? Something shifted in Daniel's expression. The most human thing that had crossed his face all evening. She knows I fix things. She likes to watch. When I work on the old cars in the garage at home, I have a Buick I've been rebuilding for 3 years. She sits on the workbench and hands me tools. She knows the name of most of the basic hand tools. He paused. She calls a torque wrench a twisty stick. Something moved at the corner of Whitmore's mouth. And what does she want to be when she grows up? Changes weekly, Daniel said. Last week it was a marine biologist. Week before that it was a baker. 2 months ago she told me she wanted to be a car doctor because she'd watched me fix a neighbor's transmission and she said, and I quote, "Daddy, you talked to the car like it was a patient. And then you made it better." Whitmore was quiet. Then she said, "Daniel, I'd like to make some calls tomorrow morning. With your permission." He looked at her carefully. "What kind of calls?" "The kind that open doors that have been closed to you," she said. "I spent 40 years building relationships in this industry. I have a long list of people who trust my judgment, and my judgment is that you have a diagnostic intuition that cannot be taught. It can be developed, trained, focused, but the core of it, that thing you did tonight, the listening, that is not in any curriculum." The room was loud around them. The gala in full swing now, the event recovered, the evening proceeding as planned. Somewhere across the room, the Ferrari's engine had been shut off for the display, and the car sat in its proper position, and probably most of the guests who were talking about it didn't know the full story of what had happened in the last hour. But some of them did. And Daniel was aware, without looking up, that he was being watched. Not the way he'd been watched when Victoria looked at him and saw a maintenance worker. Something else. Something that had a different quality to it entirely. "Why would you do this?" he asked Whitmore quietly. "You don't know me." "I know what I saw," she said. "And I know what I've spent 40 years not seeing enough of people like you. People who know things that didn't come from a classroom, who have been filtered out before anyone could benefit from what they know." She paused. "And I am 74 years old, Daniel. I don't have a great deal of patience left for waiting to do the things that seem right." He was quiet for a long moment. "My daughter needs new shoes," he said. It was not the response either of them expected him to give. He said it not as a complaint, not as a pitch for sympathy, but as the simple truth of where he lived, the grounded, concrete reality of a man whose life was built not around ambition or legacy or position, but around the small, specific, urgent needs of a 9-year-old who'd outgrown her sneakers. Whitmore looked at him, and then something happened that Daniel Carter had not seen coming, that he would not have predicted in 100 guesses about how this night would end. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, who had consulted for Ferrari for 4 decades and held 3 patents and watched more talented engineers fail and mediocre ones succeed than she could count, and who had not cried in public in 22 years, since her husband's retirement dinner, pressed her lips together against something that was climbing her throat. She composed herself in about 3 seconds. She was very practiced at composure, but Daniel had seen it. "She'll have them," Whitmore said. Sophia posted the video at 11:17 that night. She had edited it down to 47 seconds. She'd thought about not posting it. She'd thought about it for a long time, sitting on the edge of her bed in her apartment on West 51st Street, watching the video on her phone with the sound on, then with the sound off, then on again. The video showed Victoria, in the moment she looked at Daniel's boots and his badge and said, "You clean this building," and it showed Daniel's face when she said it, not wounded, not angry, just that particular controlled steadiness that is harder to watch than anger, because it tells you exactly how many times this has happened before, and it showed the Ferrari starting, and it showed the crowd's faces in the moment it started, and it showed Victoria's face in that same moment, and it showed Daniel walking away, just walking, back toward the service corridor, quiet and complete and utterly without performance. Sophia typed a caption, deleted it, typed another one, deleted that too. Finally, she just wrote, "This happened tonight." That's all. She hit post. Then she put her phone face down on her nightstand, because she had the feeling that when she picked it up again in the morning, the number on the screen was going to be very large, and she wasn't sure yet how she felt about that. She was right. By 6 a.m., the video had 4 million views. By 8 a.m., it was 11 million. By the time Daniel Carter woke up and made Emma's breakfast and packed her lunch and walked her to the school bus stop, his phone had 847 unread notifications and 3 voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 text from Marcus that said only, "Check your phone when you get a chance. No rush." Well, maybe some rush. He watched Emma's bus pull away from the curb. He stood on the sidewalk in the early morning cold and looked at his phone. 847 notifications. He put the phone in his pocket. He had a shift at 8:30. He had a circuit breaker panel in the east corridor that he'd noted yesterday was showing unusual draw, and if he didn't check it today, it would become a problem by next week. He had a building full of people who needed the lights to work, and the elevator to run, and the HVAC to function. And none of that was going to take care of itself because a video went somewhere unexpected overnight. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and walked toward the building. But something was different now, and he knew it, even if he couldn't name it yet, and it walked with him down that sidewalk in the early morning cold. The way certain things walk with you once they've started, not loudly, not insistently, but with a patience that tells you it's not going anywhere. Something had shifted. The question was what he was going to do about it. He found out at 9:47, when the phone rang again, and this time the name on the screen was one he recognized. Emma's school. His heart did the thing it always did, when the school called a quick, cold drop before reason caught up with reflex, but the voice on the other end was calm. "Mr. Carter, this is Principal Ochoa. Emma is completely fine, I want to say that first." "Okay," he said, the drop receding. "What's going on?" "Well," Principal Ochoa said, and he could hear something in her voice that he couldn't immediately identify, something that was not alarm and not routine, and was somewhere in the interesting middle ground between. Emma came in this morning and told her class that her dad fixed a Ferrari last night and saved a party, and then apparently one of the other parents saw a video. And I don't know how to explain this precisely, Mr. Carter. So, I'm just going to tell you what's happening. There are currently 3 journalists outside our front entrance asking whether Emma Carter is enrolled at this school. Daniel was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "Don't let them near her," he said. "We absolutely won't. She's in class, she's happy, she has no idea. But I thought you should know." "Thank you," Daniel said. "I'll be there at pickup." He hung up. He stood in the building corridor, outside the circuit breaker panel and he'd come to inspect, with his hand flat against the wall and his eyes closed. Emma. His Emma, who called a torque wrench a twisty stick and wanted to be a marine biologist and a baker and a car doctor, and who had probably walked into school this morning with her chin up and told her whole class that her daddy was amazing, in the particular fearless way of 9-year-olds, who have no concept yet of what the world does to people who believe too openly in the people they love. He pressed his hand harder against the wall. Then he breathed. Then he opened his eyes. Then he opened the circuit breaker panel, got to work, because the building wasn't going to take care of itself, and his daughter was safe, and whatever was happening out there in the world of videos and notifications and journalists on school steps, it was going to have to wait until he understood the unusual draw on panel 3, because that was the job in front of him. And Daniel Carter had learned from the best that you do the job in front of you. That's all it ever is. He worked steadily for 20 minutes. He found the issue an overloaded leg on a 3-phase panel, not dangerous yet, but trending in a direction that would become dangerous in another few weeks without attention. He logged it. He submitted a maintenance request for the licensed electrician to evaluate the load distribution. He did it properly by the book, the way his father had always insisted on doing things by the book, even when doing it by the book took longer. The shortcut is always longer in the end, Daniel, because the shortcut always breaks. He closed the panel. He checked his watch. 10:22. He looked at his phone. 14 new voicemails. 1 text from Marcus. "She wants to meet with you today." Victoria. "I told her you're working until 5. She said she'd wait." Daniel stared at that text for a long time. Victoria Valentina, who had built an automotive empire, who had 200 people watching her every move, who had looked at his boots and decided in under 4 seconds what he He was worth Victoria Valentina was going to wait until 5 o'clock. He thought about what that meant, what it cost her, what it said, not about him, but about her. About the particular way that people who have built everything on being certain about things begin to reckon with a moment when their certainty was visibly, publicly, and undeniably wrong. He thought about what he wanted, not what he was supposed to want, not what the narrative of the thing maintenance worker fixes the car, CEO is humiliated, world watches, man gets his due seemed to call for. What he actually wanted, what felt true. He wanted Emma to have new shoes. He wanted to finish the Buick he'd been rebuilding for 3 years. He wanted, more than anything, to do work that meant something, every day, not just in the moments when the circumstances were dramatic enough for people to pay attention. He texted Marcus back. "Tell her I'll be there at 5:15. I need 15 minutes after shift to clean up." Marcus responded in under a minute. "You're going to make her wait an extra 15 minutes?" Daniel typed, "I'm going to respect my own shift. There's a difference." 3 dots. Then Marcus, "Your father would like you." Daniel put the phone back in his pocket. He picked up his cart. He kept working. Word traveled through the building, the way it always travels through any place where people work together closely. Not as an announcement, not as deliberate communication, but as a current. By noon, the security guard at the front desk, a 58-year-old man named Pete who had worked the day shift for 9 years and knew Daniel well enough to know how he took his coffee, stopped him in the lobby. "Saw the video," Pete said. "Yeah," Daniel said, 11 million views. "I heard." Pete looked at him for a moment. "You okay?" It was such a simple question, such a direct, unadorned human question. Not what's going to happen, or what are you going to do, or do you understand what this means? Just, are you okay? Daniel felt something in his chest that he wasn't going to name out loud, not here in the lobby with Pete watching him and the camera above the door running. "I'm okay," he said. "Emma's school called." Pete's expression changed. "She all right?" "She's fine." Journalists outside. Pete shook his head slowly. "World's something else." "Yeah," Daniel agreed. "She know what happened? Your daughter?" "Probably. She talks a lot." Daniel almost smiled. "She told her whole class this morning." Pete laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of him, the kind you can't manufacture. "Of course she did." He shook his head again, but with something softer in it now. "Good kid, she really is," Daniel said. He picked up his card again. "Back to it, Pete." "Hey, Daniel." He turned. Pete was looking at him with an expression that had something measured and serious in it. The expression of a man who has been around long enough to know the difference between a moment and a moment that matters. "Whatever happens next," Pete said, "don't let them make you into something you're not. Okay? Whatever they offer you, whatever they tell you you deserve, you're good as you are. You hear me?" Daniel held his gaze. "I hear you," he said. He meant it. He went back to work. He was 3 minutes late. Not because he'd forgotten, and not because he was making a point, though Marcus would later tease him that it looked like both. He was late because the third-floor men's restroom had a running toilet that nobody had reported, and Daniel had heard it on his way to the locker room at 4:58, and he had stopped and fixed it, because that was the job. And the job didn't pause, because someone important was waiting upstairs. He changed his shirt, washed his hands twice, looked in the mirror for about 3 seconds, the same as the night before. He went upstairs at 5:18. Victoria was standing near the window on the far side of the showroom. Not sitting, standing. Her arms were not crossed tonight, which Daniel noticed the way he noticed everything, without making it obvious that he'd noticed. She was in a different outfit than last night, which meant she'd gone home and come back, or she kept clothes at the office, and either one of those things told him something about what this meeting cost her. The showroom was empty except for the two of them, and Marcus, who was at the engineering station, pretending to read something on a tablet. Marcus was not reading anything. He was staying close enough to intervene if necessary, which was the most Marcus thing Daniel had ever witnessed. Victoria turned when she heard him come in. She did not smile. She was not the kind of person who smiled to manage a situation. Whatever she was feeling, she was going to say it directly, and Daniel respected that even now. "You're late," she said. "Running toilet on 3, Daniel said. "I fixed it on the way down." She stared at him. Of course you did, she said. And there was something in her voice, not mockery, not the version of that phrase she might have used last night. Something more complicated. Something that sounded almost like she was talking to herself. She gestured toward the seating area. Will you sit? Sure, he said. They sat across from each other in the chairs that had probably been arranged for investor conversations and partnership negotiations. And Daniel thought about the fact that the last time he'd sat in a chair in this building, it was next to Dr. Whitmore. And everything that had come after that was still moving, still unfolding, and he was not sure he had caught up with it yet. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She had the expression of a person who has rehearsed something and is now deciding whether the rehearsed version is the honest version. She went with honest. I owe you an apology, she said. Not a qualified one. Not the kind that explains the circumstances first and gets to sorry as an afterthought. Just I'm sorry. What I said to you last night in front of those people was wrong. Not just tactically, not just in retrospect. It was wrong in the moment, and some part of me knew it was wrong in the moment. And I said it anyway. Daniel was quiet. I looked at your uniform, she said, and I made a decision about who you were, and I was wrong. He let the silence hold for a moment. Not to punish her with it, just because it deserved to be held. I know you were, he said. She blinked. She'd expected something softer. And it's okay, or a don't worry about it. The social reflex that lets people off the hook before the hook has done its work. Daniel not giving her that made her sit straighter. Almost involuntarily. Why are you still working in building maintenance? She asked. It wasn't small talk. It was direct and genuine. The question of someone trying to understand a situation that doesn't make sense to them. Because it pays the bills, Daniel said. And because the places that would pay me more to do the work I actually know how to do wanted a degree first and a demonstration second. I could never get to the demonstration. You applied to engineering firms. Many of them, including 2 that supply parts to your company, which I'm guessing you've already looked up. She didn't deny it. Your application to Meridian Technical was declined at the resume screening stage. Yes, before anyone looked at what you actually submitted for the skills assessment. I never got to the skills assessment, Daniel said. They screen by education first. Victoria was quiet for a moment. Meridian supplies components to our hybrid systems division. I've been working with their leadership for 6 years. She paused. I called David Meridian this morning. Daniel looked at her. About what? About the fact that they have a diagnostic specialist position that's been open for 4 months, she said. And about the fact that I watched a man last night do in 4 minutes what that position has been failing to fill for 4 months. She held his gaze. David wants to meet you. The room was very quiet. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not with excitement, with caution. The particular caution of a man who has been in this neighborhood before, the neighborhood of something that looks like a door opening, and has learned that what looks like a door from a distance is not always a door when you get close enough to touch it. Because of the video, he said. Partly, Victoria said. And partly because I described what you did technically, step by step. And David Meridian is a practical man, and practical men respond to results. She paused. But I want to be honest with you. The video is why this is happening at the speed it's happening. Without it, you'd still be in that corridor, with your maintenance cart. He appreciated that. The honesty of it. The willingness to say the thing that made her role in it smaller. What does the position pay? He asked. She told him. He didn't react visibly. But inside he felt something that was not quite elation and not quite disbelief, and was somewhere between them a vertigo, a sudden sense of the ground shifting under his feet in a way that felt both terrifying and right. It was 3 times his current salary. Emma's shoes. The Buick. The garage lease he'd been thinking about for 2 years. All of it rearranging in his head in the space of about 4 seconds. I'd want to earn it, he said. On the work, not on the story. David understands that, Victoria said. The interview will be technical. He's going to put things in front of you that have nothing to do with last night. She paused. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The grounding bridge you added to the junction. That's not in any Ferrari service manual for this system. That modification was creative. It wasn't just fixing what was broken. You anticipated a future failure mode and addressed it preemptively. She leaned forward slightly. Where did that come from? Daniel thought about it. About how to say something that was true without sounding like he was making himself bigger than he was. When my father had a car come through the shop with an intermittent fault, he said, his rule was, you never fix just the fault. You fix the system that allowed the fault to develop. Because the fault didn't happen in isolation. Something made it possible. And if you don't address that, you're going to see that car again in 3 months. Victoria was quiet. He taught me that the job isn't done when the symptom is gone, Daniel continued. The job is done when the condition that created the symptom is gone. Those are two different things. He paused. The pin was the symptom. The vibration tolerance of that junction interface under startup load conditions was the condition. So I addressed the condition. Victoria looked at him for a long time. Then she said, I have been building this company for 10 years. I have hired approximately 400 engineers in that time. I have paid for graduate degrees and international certifications and team retreats, where we talk about innovative thinking. She stopped. Fewer than 10 of those 400 engineers have ever described their diagnostic philosophy the way you just described it. Daniel didn't say anything. I want to offer you something, she said. In addition to the Meridian introduction, I want to offer you a consulting relationship with Valentina Motors. Informal to start. I'm not asking you to leave your current job yet. I know you can't afford uncertainty with a child. What I'm asking is whether you'd be willing to look at some of the electrical fault histories we've been logging on our hybrid fleet that our current diagnostics team hasn't been able to resolve. Cold case faults, Daniel said. She blinked again. That's exactly what our lead engineer calls them. Because they're cases where the symptoms presented, the system recovered, the diagnostic came back clean, and the fault never officially happened. But the driver felt it. And 3 months later, the car comes back with a real failure. He nodded slowly. I know those cases. How? Because that's the only work that was interesting enough to do at night for free, he said simply. Victoria stared at him. For free, she said. Neighbors. Friends of friends. People who couldn't afford the dealer diagnostic fee and couldn't afford to have the car fail on them. I'd look at it on weekends. He paused. In the last 2 years, I've resolved 7 cases like that on personal vehicles. Cold case electrical faults. Systems that tested clean, but were failing intermittently. Victoria turned to Marcus. Did you know this? I found out an hour ago, Marcus said without looking up from the tablet he was still pretending to read. 7 cases, Victoria said, in 2 years, on your own time. The cases were interesting, Daniel said. The simplicity of it landed in the room again. The way simple, true things tend to land with a weight that the complicated version of the same idea never quite achieves. Victoria let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Okay, she said. The cold case file is yours if you want it. On your terms, your timeline, around your schedule. And when you're ready, whether that's after the Meridian interview, or 6 months from now, or whenever it makes sense for you, I want to have a longer conversation about what your role here could look like. She paused. I also want to say one more thing, she said. And I want to say it because it's true and not because I think it's what you want to hear. She looked at him directly. What I did last night damaged you, publicly, in front of people who make decisions that affect careers. I can't undo that, but I can be the voice that tells the accurate version of what happened in that room, and I intend to be. She paused. I've already spoken to Giorgio Ferrante and to Christina Park at Autovision. They both heard from me this morning. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I don't need anyone to tell my story, he said carefully. I appreciate what you're doing. But I want to be clear, I'm not interested in a version of this, where I become a story that's useful to someone else. Including you. Victoria held very still. That's fair, she said. And she meant it. What I am interested in, Daniel continued, is the work. The cold case file, the Meridian introduction, whatever conversation comes after, that I'm interested in, all of it, because it's the work. Not because of what happened last night. Not because of the video. He paused. The video isn't who I am. It's one night. My father worked for 32 years in a garage that nobody outside of a 40-mile radius knew existed, and he was one of the best in the world at what he did, and 0 people filmed him doing it. That didn't make him less. Victoria looked at him for a long time. "No," she said quietly. It didn't. Marcus, at the engineering station, had stopped pretending to read. Daniel left Valentina Motors at 6:47. He had an envelope in his jacket pocket, the cold case file, printed, which Marcus had handed him, with the expression of a man delivering something sacred. And he had David Meridian's direct number saved in his phone, and he had the particular weight of a day that had moved faster than any day, had a right to move, settling across his shoulders. As he stepped out onto the Manhattan sidewalk, the evening was cold and clear. The kind of cold that makes the city feel more real, sharper edges, brighter lights, the sound of traffic carrying further than usual. He stood on the sidewalk outside the building for about 30 seconds, just breathing. His phone rang. It was a number he'd seen twice today already without answering. Chicago area code. He answered it this time. "Mr. Carter, my name is Robert Chang. I'm the department chair of Automotive Engineering Technology at Northwestern Polytechnic. I know this call may seem unusual." "How did you get this number?" Daniel asked. He was going to have to ask Marcus about that. "Dr. Eleanor Whitmore," Chiang said. "Of course. I understand you've had a full day," Chiang said carefully. "I'll be brief. We have a program at Northwestern Poly that we've been developing for the past 3 years. It's a credentialing track, not a traditional degree program specifically designed for working professionals with demonstrable technical expertise who have been excluded from advancement by credential requirements." He paused.
"Dr. Whitmore called me at 7 this morning and told me about what she witnessed last night."
She was quite insistent. Daniel could imagine. What would the program involve? 12 months, mostly remote, with 4 in-person assessment weekends. At the end, you'd have an accredited certification in automotive diagnostic systems engineering. Not an honorary credential, a real one, built on a portfolio of demonstrated work, technical assessments, and a final project. Another pause. There would be no cost to you. We have pre-terpet funding specifically for this program. And Dr. Whitmore has indicated she would like to sponsor your cohort personally. Daniel stood on the sidewalk and watched a cab move through the intersection. "Why?" he said, not rudely, just the actual question. "Because the program needs someone to prove that it works," Chang said. "And because Dr. Whitmore told me, in her exact words, that you are the most compelling argument she has encountered in 40 years for why the current credentialing system is broken." He paused. "She also told me about your daughter." Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. "Emma has nothing to do with this," he said. "I know," Chang said quickly. "I mentioned it only because it's part of why this matters. You've been doing this work at the highest level, while raising a child alone, without support, without recognition, without the professional infrastructure that most people in your position would have had. That context matters to us in terms of who this program is built for." Daniel was quiet. "I need some time." "Of course," Chang said. "Take all the time you need. My number is in your phone. Whenever you're ready." They hung up. Daniel put his phone in his pocket and started walking toward the subway. He walked for 2 blocks before he realized his hands were shaking. Not from cold. From something that lived right on the boundary between hope and terror, the feeling you get when things you stop letting yourself want start appearing in front of you. And you have to decide whether to believe them. He stopped at a crosswalk. The light was red. He took both hands out of his pockets and looked at them. His father's hands, people used to say. Same shape, same width across the knuckles, same way of moving, careful and precise and never wasted. His father's hands on a 34-year-old body that had spent 14 months pushing a maintenance cart around a building where nobody knew his name. The light changed. He walked. Emma was still awake when he got home, which meant she'd negotiated an extension with the babysitter, Mrs. Ramirez, and the negotiation had almost certainly involved promises about homework that Emma had no intention of keeping. She was sitting on the couch in her pajamas with a book she wasn't reading, positioned in the way of a child who has been listening for the sound of a key in the lock for the last hour. She launched herself off the couch before he'd fully closed the door. He caught her, which he'd been doing since she was 18 months old, and showed her first signs of being completely aerodynamic. and held her the way he always held her, one arm under, one arm around. Her weight settled against his chest like a key in a lock. "Dad," she said, into his shoulder. "Hey, Bug, everyone at school was talking about you today." "I heard," he said. "Madison Kowalski said you were on the news." "I don't know about that." She showed me on her phone. Emma pulled back to look at his face. She had her mother's eyes, a fact that hit Daniel differently depending on the day. And tonight, it hit him softly, with a gentleness the day had earned. "You fixed the really expensive car." "I fixed a connector pin," he said. "The car fixed itself." Emma considered this, with the seriousness of a 9-year-old processing a philosophical distinction. "That's the same thing." "Not exactly, Dad." She gave him the look that meant stop being modest. "I am 9 years old, and I understand more than you think. The car wasn't working. Then you touched it, then it worked. That's you fixing it." He almost smiled. "Your logic is very sound." "I know." She settled back against him. "Are you famous now?" "No, you might be a little famous." "I'm not famous." Madison Kowalski says. "Madison Kowalski is 9 years old," Daniel said. "Like you." "She's 9.5, Emma said. "She thinks that makes a difference." He laughed. An actual laugh, surprised out of him, the first real one of the day. He held his daughter tighter for a moment, and pressed his cheek against the top of her head, and let himself for about 5 seconds. Not be a man with shaking hands and a phone full of notifications and a life that had tilted 47 degrees in the last 24 hours. Just her dad. Just the person she launched herself at when she heard his key in the door. "Mrs. Ramirez says you negotiated another 30 minutes, he said. I said, "Maybe, Emma." I finished most of the reading. "Go brush your teeth," he said. "I'll come in 5 minutes. She went, which meant she was tired enough, that the negotiation wasn't worth the energy. He stood in the small living room of their apartment and looked around at the things that were theirs: the satin couch, the bookshelf. She'd arranged herself with a 5-year-old's organizational logic that he'd never had the heart to change. The framed photo on the windowsill of him, and Emma and his father, taken in the garage, all three of them covered in grease and grinning, the summer before his father got sick. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to his daughter's room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and told her a story, not the same tooth fairy story, from 3 weeks ago, a new one, about a man who spent his whole life knowing how to listen to the things that most people had stopped listening to, and what happened when the world got quiet enough to hear him. Emma was asleep before the man in the story got his chance, which was fine. The ending could wait. He was back at work at 8:30 the next morning. The day was different from the moment he walked in the front entrance. He felt it immediately, a change in the texture of being in the building, something in the way people moved around him, or didn't, in the way Pete at the front desk looked up, and then looked again. A second look he'd never given Daniel in 14 months. "Morning," Pete said. "Morning. Videos at 30 million, Pete said. Daniel stopped pushing his cart. 30, as of 6 a.m. I checked. Pete shook his head. "You're everywhere, man." Daniel pushed his cart to the service elevator. He pressed the button and waited. The elevator arrived, and the doors opened, and inside it was Jason, Victoria's lead engineer, in the expensive clothes that MIT graduates wear to work, with a coffee in his hand, and the expression of a man who spent the entire previous day revising his opinion of something. They looked at each other. "Morning," Daniel said. "Morning," Jason said, a pause. "Hey, I wanted to say, about last night." He stopped, recalibrated. "I've been in this field for 6 years. I've run thousands of diagnostics. I would not have found that fault. Not without the approach you used." He paused. "I actually went home and looked up your technique. The tactile resonance method for intermittent contact faults. It's in the literature. There's a paper from 1987 from a German engineer named Kessler, who documented it in the context of vintage race car restoration. Nobody uses it anymore. It's been replaced by time domain signal analysis." Another pause. "Theoretically replaced. Your method actually works faster in certain fault profiles." Daniel looked at him. "My father learned it from a man who learned it from someone in the 60s, he said. "It didn't come from a paper." Jason nodded slowly. "That's actually, yeah." He stepped out of the elevator. "Anyway, I wanted to say something, so He lifted his coffee in a gesture that was part acknowledgement, part departure. He walked away. Daniel got in the elevator. The doors closed. He allowed himself, in the privacy of the elevator, with no one watching, a very small exhale that contained about 14 hours of held tension. Then the doors opened on the third floor, and he got back to work. The call from Meridian Technical came at 2:17 in the afternoon. He was in the parking structure on level 2, investigating an issue with the ventilation system that building management had flagged as a noise complaint, which turned out to be a worn bearing in the exhaust fan motor. Simple, documented 40-minute fix. He was halfway through it when his phone rang, and the screen showed David Meridian's direct number, which Victoria had apparently already given. David had apparently decided not to wait for a formal scheduling conversation. Daniel answered with grease on his hand. "David Meridian," said the voice. Direct, no nonsense, the voice of an engineer who had made enough money to never have to perform warmth, and had apparently decided not to start. "Victoria Valentina tells me you fixed the SF90. I repaired a connector pin," Daniel said. A brief pause. "You also added a secondary ground bridge that wasn't in the Ferrari service documentation, and that our engineers reviewed this morning and believe will extend the junction's system's service life by a factor of 3, under real-world operating conditions." Another pause. "Where did you get that approach?" "Fault prevention logic," Daniel said. "Fix the system, not just the symptom." "Silence, I want to meet you," Meridian said. "Victoria mentioned you might. Can you be in Hoboken Thursday?" Daniel thought about his shift schedule. He'd need to swap with Carlos on the East Wing. Carlos owed him a shift from 2 months ago anyway. "Yes," he said. 9 a.m. Bring nothing ex what you know." Meridian paused. "I've spent 30 years building a company on the principle that competence is competence, regardless of where it comes from. I have 17 engineers in my diagnostic division. I need an 18th who thinks differently from the other 17. Based on what Victoria described, you might be that person. Thursday will tell me whether she's right. And if I don't pass," Daniel said, "then we shake hands and you go back to your work, and I go back to mine," Meridian said. "No performance, no story, just the technical assessment." He paused. "That work for you?" "That works for me," Daniel said. "Thursday," Meridian said, and hung up. Daniel held the phone for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket and turned back to the fan motor. He still had the bearing to finish. The ventilation issue wasn't going to resolve itself, because David Meridian had called. He picked up the press tool and got back to it. But something was different now in the quality of the work. Not its quality, the work was the same as it always was, careful and complete, and done by the book. But the feeling of the work had changed. The same feeling that had been walking with him since yesterday morning, the patient unnamed thing, was a little closer now, a little less abstract. Not hope. He was careful about hope. Something more durable than hope. He finished the bearing replacement in 22 minutes. The fan ran quiet and smooth. He documented it, packed his tools, and moved toward the elevator. He was in the lobby, heading for the supply room, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. He'd been letting unknowns go all day, but something made him check it. The text said, "My name is Richard Okafor. I'm a producer at WGN America in Chicago. We're developing a documentary series about skilled tradespeople in America. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore suggested I reach out. If you have any interest in being involved, I'd love to talk. No pressure, no rush. Just the world needs to know this story exists." Daniel read it twice. He put his phone in his pocket. He walked to the supply room. He thought about his father, who had worked in that garage for 32 years, in a town 40 miles outside Detroit, and who had never been the subject of a documentary, and who had been without question, without argument, without any video or viral moment to make it legible to strangers, one of the best in the world, at the thing he loved. And he thought about what his father would say if Daniel told him about the last 48 hours. About Victoria, and the Ferrari, and Dr. Whitmore, and Meridian, and Northwestern Poly, and now a documentary producer in Chicago. About Emma telling her whole class. About 30 million views. His father would have listened to all of it. He would have let Daniel talk until it ran out. He would have waited a beat, the way he always waited, to make sure the talking was really finished. And then he would have said, "So what are you going to do?" Not "what are you going to feel?" Not "how does it make you feel?" What are you going to do? Because doing was the thing that was real. The rest of it was weather. Daniel opened the supply room and got what he needed for the afternoon's work list. He had a stuck HVAC damper on the 7th floor. He had a loose stair tread on the east stairwell that he'd been monitoring for a week, and that was now ready for the full repair. He had 8 cold case files in an envelope in his jacket pocket that Victoria Valentina had handed him with something in her face that was not quite apology and not quite respect, but was trying to be both. He had a 9-year-old daughter who was probably right now sitting in her 4th period class thinking about marine biology or baking or car doctoring, depending on the week. He had a Buick at home in various states of completion, pieces of it laid out on the garage floor with the particular, patient logic of a job that you do in time the rest of your life allows. He had Thursday in Hoboken. He had a number in Chicago that he would answer eventually when he knew what he wanted to say. He closed the supply room door. He picked up his cart. He moved toward the elevator because the building needed its people, and Daniel Carter was one of its people, and whatever the world outside was deciding about who he was and what he deserved, in here the HVAC damper on the 7th floor was still stuck, and the east stairwell tread was still loose, and the work was still the work. The same work it had always been, the same hands, the same patience, the same father's voice in the back of his head that had never once told him to stop, to give up, to make himself smaller than the space he actually filled. He pressed the elevator button. He waited. The doors opened. He got in. He took the PATH train. He could have taken a cab. The Meridian introduction was professional enough that expensing a cab would have been reasonable if he'd had an expense account, which he didn't. But the PATH was 12 minutes from the station, near his apartment to Hoboken Terminal, and Daniel had never been a cab person. He sat in the second car from the front, the way his father had always sat on trains, because his father believed the front car was for people who needed to prove they were in a hurry, and the back car was for people who'd already given up, and the second car from the front was for people who knew where they were going and weren't performing about it. He had the cold case files in his bag. He'd spent Tuesday night and most of Wednesday going through all 8 of them at the kitchen table. After Emma went to bed, a cup of coffee going cold beside him, his handwriting in the margins getting smaller and more compressed as the hours got later and the pattern got more interesting. He hadn't planned to work that late. He'd told himself he'd do 2 files and go to sleep. He'd done all 8. 3 of them had something in common that the engineering notes hadn't caught. A pattern in the fault interval timing that suggested not a component failure, but a systemic interaction between 2 separate subsystems under specific thermal conditions. He'd written 4 pages of notes on it. He hadn't been asked to do that. He'd done it because the pattern was there, and he couldn't unknow it once he'd seen it. He'd texted Marcus at 11:42 at night, the cold case files. Cases 3, 5, and 7. Same root cause, different symptoms. Thermal interaction between the HV battery management system and the secondary cooling loop. It's not showing up in the individual system diagnostic because neither system is technically failing. The failure is in the interaction. Marcus had responded at 11:44. Go to sleep, Daniel. Then, 40 seconds later, also, I'll look at this tomorrow. And if you're right, I'm going to be extremely annoyed at how right you are. Then at 6:17 the next morning, you're right. Go to Thursday. That was the whole conversation. That was enough. He got off the train at Hoboken Terminal at 8:41 and walked the 6 blocks to Meridian Technical's facility. The building was not impressive from the outside, which Daniel immediately respected. Companies that spent money on impressive exteriors were usually compensating for something. Companies that spent money on what happened inside were usually the ones worth working for. He checked in at the front desk. The woman who greeted him was professional and brief and gave nothing away in terms of whether she knew who he was or what the video had become, or any of the 48 hours that had preceded this morning. She handed him a visitor badge and told him David would be out in a moment. David Meridian came out in 4 minutes. He was 61 years old and built like a man who had spent his 20s doing something physical and his 30s doing something technical and had arrived at his 60s in the shape of both. He had the handshake of a person for whom the handshake is information gathering rather than ceremony. He looked at Daniel's eyes when he shook his hand, not at his clothes, which Daniel noticed and filed. "Daniel," Meridian said, "come in." He didn't say glad you could make it or thanks for coming or any of the other things that people say when they want the arrival to feel like the event. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, which meant Daniel was supposed to follow, which he did. The engineering floor was large and organized, with the precise, unsentimental order of a place where people were serious about the work. Workbenches, diagnostic equipment, vehicles in various states of assessment, a whiteboard on the far wall covered in diagrams that Daniel's eyes went to immediately and wanted to stay on. He kept walking. Meridian led him to a smaller room at the back, not an office, a workspace, with a bench in the center, and 3 vehicles worth of disassembled hybrid components arranged on it with identifying tags. He stopped and turned. "No presentation," Meridian said. "No tour, no lunch, no getting to know you. We can do all of that if Thursday goes well. Right now, I want to know what you see." He gestured at the components on the bench. "These are from 3 of our active client vehicles," he said. "All 3 have intermittent electrical faults that our diagnostic team has not been able to reproduce or resolve. The fault histories are in the folders on the left. Client notes are in the folders on the right. My team's diagnostic notes are in the middle folders. You have 2 hours. Tell me what you find." He stepped back. "Should I?" Daniel started. "Work the way you work," Meridian said. "Not the way you think I want you to work, the way you actually work." A pause. "That's the whole point." He left the room. Daniel stood alone with the components and the folders. He put his bag down. He did not open a folder first, which would have been the expected approach. Read the history, understand the context, then examine the physical evidence. He went to the components first, because that was how his father had taught him, and his father had been right. The documentation tells you what other people saw, but the components tell you what's actually there. And sometimes those are 2 very different things. He started with his hands. 40 minutes later, Meridian came back. Daniel didn't hear him come in. He was crouched beside the 3rd vehicle's battery junction assembly, which he'd reassembled partway in order to replicate a specific load condition, and his focus had collapsed to a space of about 2 cubic feet in front of him. He heard Meridian's footstep and registered it without turning. "You reassembled the junction assembly," Meridian said. "I needed to recreate the thermal load state," Daniel said. "The fault won't present in the disassembled configuration. The interaction between the BMS feedback signal and the secondary cooling loop only happens when both systems are under concurrent load." He looked up. "I can show you." Meridian was quiet for a moment. "Show me." Daniel walked him through it. Not performing, not presenting, just talking. The way you talk when you're explaining something you genuinely understand to someone you think can follow it. He showed the interaction point, demonstrated the thermal threshold at which the interaction produced a signal conflict, explained why the individual system diagnostics came back clean, and why the fault would only reproduce under a specific combination of conditions that real-world driving produced regularly, but that bench diagnostic protocols didn't replicate. Meridian asked 2 questions during the explanation. Both questions were the right questions. The questions of someone who was following and checking, not someone who was lost. When Daniel finished, Meridian was quiet for about 15 seconds. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was a working silence. The silence of a person updating their model of a situation. "Cases 3, 5, and 7 in the Valentina cold case files," Meridian said. "Same root cause?" Daniel stared at him. "How did you know about those?" "Marcus Hale called me yesterday morning," Meridian said. "He told me you'd identified a pattern in cases 3, 5, and 7. He also told me you'd done it in one night, after your shift, without being asked." Daniel said nothing. "I had my team look at those 3 cases. Before you came in this morning," Meridian continued. "They've been looking at them for 4 hours. They haven't found what you found." He paused. "I want to understand the method, not just the result. The method." So Daniel explained the method. He explained it the way his father had taught it, not as a procedure, because it wasn't a procedure, but as a philosophy. The philosophy of listening to a system the way you'd listen to a person, telling you something they didn't have the words for. The philosophy of looking for what the data couldn't say. The philosophy of following the pattern, underneath the pattern, the one that existed in the interaction between systems rather than in any individual system's behavior. Meridian listened to all of it without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Meridian said, "I want to offer you a position." Daniel had been half expecting it and was still not ready for it. "Before you respond," Meridian said, "let me tell you what the position is, because it's not what Victoria described. Victoria described the open diagnostic specialist role. I'm not offering you that." Daniel waited. "I'm offering you the lead diagnostic position," Meridian said. "Senior level, team oversight, client interface, and the latitude to develop the method you just described into a replicable protocol that my team can learn." He named the salary. It was 40% higher than what Victoria had mentioned 2 days ago. The room was quiet. Daniel's hands were completely still. "I have 17 engineers on my diagnostic team," Meridian continued. 11 of them have advanced degrees. 6 of them have more than a decade of experience. Not one of them found what you found this morning in 2 hours. He paused. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know the difference between luck and ability. I know the difference between a good result and genuine competence." He held Daniel's gaze. "What you have is the second thing, and the second thing is harder to find than a degree." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. He thought about the PATH train, and Pete at the front desk, and Emma's shoes and the Buick and the 8 cold case files he'd worked through at the kitchen table until midnight, and the fact that his coffee had gone cold, and he hadn't noticed. He thought about Thursday in Hoboken being a test that he'd arrived at, not knowing if he'd pass. He thought about the second car from the front. "I want to accept," Daniel said, "but I need 2 weeks to give proper notice at my current position, and I need to talk to my daughter." Meridian nodded immediately. 2 weeks is standard, and talking to your daughter is correct. He extended his hand. "Welcome to Meridian Technical, Daniel." Daniel shook it. This time his hand was steady. He texted Marcus on the PATH train home, "I got the job." Marcus responded in 41 seconds. "Which one?" Daniel typed, "Lead diagnostic. Senior level." A longer pause this time. "Then your father would be insufferable about this. He would bring it up constantly. He would tell everyone." Another beat. "I'm bringing it up constantly. I'm telling everyone." Daniel looked at the message for a moment. Then he did something he hadn't done in 2 days. Something that the situation had not permitted, or the setting had allowed. He sat in the second car from the front of the PATH train, going back to Manhattan, with grease still worked into the creases of his knuckles from the morning's work, and he let himself feel it. Not perform it, not manage it, just feel it, the weight of a door that had been closed for a very long time, finally, legitimately, with documentation and a real salary and an actual title, opening. He sat with it for the whole 12-minute ride. Then the train arrived and the doors opened, and he stood up and walked back into his life. He picked Emma up from school at 3:15. She knew something had happened before he said a word. She was 9, but she was 9 in the particular way that children of single parents are 9, finely tuned to the emotional frequency of the one person who held everything together, capable of reading microscopic changes in posture and expression that the person themselves didn't know they were broadcasting. "Something happened," she said as they walked. "I got a new job," he said. She grabbed his hand, not dramatically, just grabbed it and held it, and kept walking. "The car people?" "A company called Meridian Technical, parts for hybrid vehicles. I'm going to be their lead diagnostic engineer." Emma was quiet for half a block. "Processing." He could almost hear the processing. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means I find out why cars aren't working correctly, even when the computers say they're fine," he said. "And I build methods to fix it. Like what you did with the Ferrari. Exactly like that." Another half block of quiet. "Will you still fix our neighbors' cars on weekends?" she asked. Daniel looked at her. "Why?" "Because I like handing you the tools," she said simply. He stopped walking. He crouched down to her level, right there on the sidewalk, with people moving past them in both directions. And he looked at his daughter's face, her mother's eyes. his father's chin, the particular eminence of her that belonged to nobody but her, and he put his hands on her shoulders. "Yes," he said, "I will absolutely still fix the neighbors' cars on weekends." She nodded, satisfied. "Okay then." She grabbed his hand again, and they kept walking. "Dad," she said after a moment. "Yeah, Bug, can we get pizza tonight?" He laughed. "Yeah, we can get pizza. And can we stop at the shoe store on the way?" He stopped. She looked up at him with an expression of complete innocence that didn't quite conceal the calculation underneath it, because Emma Carter was her father's daughter in more ways than just the chin. "Your shoes are too tight," he said. "They've been too tight for 3 weeks," she said. "I didn't want to make it a big deal." He felt that sentence in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the Ferrari or Meridian or 30 million views or any of it. His daughter, 9 years old, hadn't wanted to make it a big deal. Had waited, had managed her own need against her read of his situation, with a quiet that she should not need to develop yet, that no 9-year-old should have to develop, and that she had developed. I dares, because Daniel had raised her in the specific reality of their life, which was tight in the way that lives are tight when one person holds everything. "Come on," he said. His voice was level, his eyes were not. They stopped at the shoe store. Emma got the ones with the lights in the soles, which Daniel had gently tried to redirect her away from 3 separate times, before accepting that the lights were non-negotiable, and that the expression on her face when they lit up was worth every cent of the $12 they cost over the plain ones. She wore them out of the store. They walked to the pizza place with her shoes flashing in the early evening dark, and Daniel watched his daughter walk and felt the specific exhaustion of a man who had been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and had just been told, by a series of events he could not have engineered or predicted, that he could maybe, possibly, hold it a little less tightly now. Not let go. He was not a let-go kind of person. His father hadn't been either. But maybe a little less tight. He gave his notice at the building the next morning. His supervisor, a man named Gerald, who was 56 and had been managing building maintenance for the same company for 19 years, heard Daniel out, and then sat behind his desk for a moment with an expression that moved through several phases, before arriving at something honest. "I can't match what they're offering you," Gerald said. "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm not going to pretend I'm surprised," Gerald said. "I've known for about 3 months that you were operating above this level. I didn't know what to do about it because we didn't have anything to offer that was at your level." He paused. "I'm glad someone did." Daniel looked at him. "You knew? The thermal interaction issue you flagged on the HVAC system in February," Gerald said. "Our maintenance contractor had been through that system 4 times and said everything was within normal parameters. You found an interaction fault between the heat pump control board and the variable frequency drive that saved this building about $30,000 in what would have been an emergency repair in July." He held Daniel's gaze. "That's not maintenance work. That's engineering." A long pause. "You never said anything," Daniel said. "What was I going to say?" Gerald asked. He spread his hands. It was not an excuse. It was a genuine question, and it had the weight of a genuine reckoning in it. "I'm a building maintenance supervisor. I didn't have the language for what you were doing, and I didn't have anything to give you for doing it." He paused. "I wrote it up in my internal report. I noted the employee and the method. I submitted it to corporate HR." He looked at Daniel steadily. Nothing happened. The room was quiet. Daniel thought about February. He remembered the HVAC fault. He remembered spending 90 minutes on it after hours because something was off in the system, interaction that the standard check hadn't caught. He'd fixed it, documented it, submitted the maintenance report, and moved on to the next job. He hadn't known Gerald had flagged it. He hadn't known anyone had noticed. "Thank you," Daniel said, "for writing it up." "Lot of good it did," Gerald said. "It mattered," Daniel said. "Even if nothing happened. It mattered that you saw it." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Something moved in the older man's face. "You're a good man, Daniel. This building's going to feel it when you're gone." He extended his hand. 2 weeks, 2 weeks, Daniel said. They shook. "I'll have full handover documentation on everything I'm currently tracking. Nothing will fall through." "I know," Gerald said. That's just who you are. The AutoVision article dropped on Saturday morning. Daniel found out from Marcus, who texted him at 7:48 a.m. Christina Park just published. Read it before you leave for the garage. He read it at the kitchen table while Emma ate cereal and examined her light-up shoes from a sitting position, tilting her feet back and forth to make them flash. Christina Park had done something unusual. She had not written the article, but the video seemed to invite the easy version. The viral moment expanded into narrative. The maintenance worker humbles the CEO arc that would have generated enormous traffic and very little truth. She had written instead about the credential gap in American automotive engineering, about the diagnostic expertise that existed outside the formal channels, about the systemic filtering that removed people like Daniel from consideration before anyone could assess what they actually knew. She had interviewed Dr. Whitmore, who said things that were precise and devastating in equal measure. She had interviewed David Meridian, who spoke in the blunt, declarative sentences of a man who had stopped being diplomatic about the industry's inefficiencies. She had interviewed Marcus, who said, simply, "I've worked alongside credentialed engineers for 38 years. Daniel Carter is in the top 5 of everyone I've ever known in this field. Not the top 5 without credentials. The top 5, period." She had interviewed Daniel on Thursday evening, after he got back from Hoboken, over the phone, while Emma was doing homework at the table and occasionally interrupting with questions about her math worksheet that Daniel answered in a low voice without stopping the interview. Christina had noticed. The article's final paragraph was about the phone interview, about Emma's math questions in the background, about the particular texture of a conversation with a man who was processing a day that had changed his life, while simultaneously helping his 9-year-old with fractions. She hadn't made it sentimental, she'd made it specific. She'd written, "The thing about Daniel Carter that the video can't capture is that the Ferrari is not the story. The Ferrari is 47 seconds. The story is 34 years of work done in the dark, of expertise developed without validation, of a man who kept showing up to the job and doing it right because the job deserved to be done right, regardless of whether anyone was watching." Daniel read that paragraph twice. Then he put his phone face down on the table and ate his breakfast. "What are you reading?" Emma asked. "An article," he said. "About you?" "Yeah." She considered this, crunching her cereal. "Is it good?" "Yeah," he said. "It's good. Can I read it?" "When you're older." "You always say that. I always mean it." She went back to her cereal and her shoes. He went back to his coffee. The morning was ordinary and warm in his. The response to the article was not something Daniel tracked in real time, because tracking it in real time would have been a way of handing his nervous system to the internet, which he had zero intention of doing. But by Sunday, Marcus had sent him a summary. The article had been shared over 1 million times. 3 engineering professional organizations had issued statements about the credential gap it described. A senator from Michigan had referenced it in a speech about workforce development. 2 universities had contacted Dr. Whitmore about consulting on their engineering curriculum. And Sophia's original 47-second video had crossed 80 million views. Daniel absorbed this information the same. He'd absorbed the news about 30 million views with a steady that wasn't numbness, wasn't indifference, was just the steadiness of a man who had learned not to let the size of the number change, the size of what he knew to be true. The number was large. The number was not the point. He spent Sunday in the garage with Emma, working on the Buick. She sat on the workbench the way she always sat, feet dangling, handing him tools on request, asking questions that ranged from genuinely mechanical to completely philosophical with no warning between them. "Dad, why does the carburetor get dirty?" "Because combustion isn't perfectly clean. There are byproducts that stick to the internal surfaces over time. Like how my room gets dirty even when I don't mess it up. That's actually a pretty good analogy." "I know." She handed him the flathead without being asked because she'd been watching and she'd read where the work was going. He took it without comment because acknowledging it would make her self-conscious, and he wanted her to stay unself-conscious about it for as long as possible. "Dad?" "Yeah." "At your new job, will you teach people your method, the way you listen to the cars?" He looked at her. "That's part of what they're asking me to do." Yeah, like how Grandpa taught you. He put down the flathead for a moment. Like that, he said. Emma nodded, absorbing it, processing. Then I think Grandpa would be happy. Daniel looked at his daughter. In the particular way that certain true things feel physically not as thought but as sensation. Somewhere behind the sternum, in the exact place where grief and gratitude live so close together that you can't always tell which one you're holding. He felt the truth of what she'd said. I think so too, Bug, he said. She handed him the torque wrench, the twisty stick, without being asked. He took it. He got back to work. Monday morning, 7:59 a.m. He walked into the building for his second-to-last week of work and found a handwritten note tucked into the handle of his maintenance cart, which was in its usual spot in the service corridor outside the supply room. The handwriting was extremely precise. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who was educated in an era when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. It said, Daniel, I have 3 more files I'd like you to look at when you have time. No urgency, and Emma's mother called me, which you didn't tell me she might. She sounds like a remarkable woman. You have good judgment in people. Dr. Eleanor Whitmore. P.S. My late husband would have liked you. He liked people who do the thing they say they'll do. Daniel stood in the service corridor for a moment. Emma's mother. That was a conversation he had not had yet, and was going to need to have, and it was a conversation that lived in a different chapter of his life, one that was quieter and more complicated and more personal than anything that had happened in the last 6 days, and he was going to need more than a Monday morning to approach it correctly. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. He picked up his cart. He went to work. He had 11 days left in this building, and he intended to finish every one of them the way he'd started, completely, correctly, without shortcuts, by the book, because his father had built that into him, so deeply it was structural, and because the building deserved it, and because Daniel Carter, whatever he was becoming in the eyes of a world that had suddenly decided to look at him, was still, at 7:59 on a Monday morning, the man who fixed the things in front of him. That hadn't changed. That was never going to change. The cart moved forward. The work continued. His last day at the building was a Thursday. Not planned that way. It just worked out that the 2 weeks landed on a Thursday, which felt right to Daniel in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Thursday had become a word with weight in it now, a word that meant something had changed. And ending here on a Thursday had the quality of a circle closing cleanly. He arrived at 7:15, 15 minutes early, the way he'd arrived every day for 14 months. He did his morning walkthrough of the building system's HVAC, elevators, electrical panels, plumbing pressure, readings, the same walkthrough he'd done every morning, documented with the same precision. Nothing skipped, because it was his last day and therefore optional. Gerald had offered to have someone shadow him for the final week to learn the building's specific quirks, and Daniel had spent 3 hours with the new hire on Tuesday and 2 more on Wednesday. Not because he was required to, but because the building deserved someone who understood it, and the fastest way to build that understanding was to transfer it directly. Pete was at the front desk when Daniel came through at 7:19. Last day, Pete said. Last day, Daniel confirmed. Pete reached under the desk and produced a white paper bag. Marie made coffee cake, the real kind from scratch, not the box. Daniel took the bag. He looked at Pete for a moment, at the 19-year face of a man who had watched hundreds of people come through this building, and had decided, at some point in the last 14 months, that Daniel was worth a handwritten note tucked into a maintenance cart, worth a story told to his wife over dinner, worth a coffee cake made from scratch on a Thursday morning. Tell Marie thank you, Daniel said. Tell her yourself, Pete said. She's coming by at noon. She wants to meet you. Daniel blinked. She's coming in, she said, and I'm quoting directly here. Pete, I am not letting that man leave without looking him in the eye. Pete had the expression of a man who had been married long enough to know when the decision had already been made. She also wants to meet Emma. Emma's in school. Marie knows. She's bringing a card. Daniel held the paper bag and felt, for the second time in a week, the specific weight of being known by people who had no reason to know him beyond the daily proximity of shared space, and who had chosen to anyway. I'll be here at noon, he said. Obviously, Pete said. You're always here. He pushed his cart to the elevator. The morning walkthrough took an hour and 12 minutes. Every reading was within normal parameters. The building was functioning correctly on his last day, which was what he'd wanted, not a problem he'd left behind, not a loose end he'd handed off unresolved, just a building that worked. He documented everything. He submitted the final maintenance log at 8:37. Then he went to the garage level and spent 2 hours cleaning and organizing the maintenance equipment room, not because it was required, because Gerald hadn't asked him to, because nobody expected it, but because that was how his father had always left a job. You leave the space better than you found it. You leave the tools where the next person can find them. You leave no evidence of your presence, except itself done right. At 10:45 his phone rang. It was a number he recognized now. Northwestern Polytechnic. Dr. Robert Chang. Daniel, Chang said. I know it's your last day at your current position. I'm not calling to add pressure. What are you calling to add? Daniel asked. I'm calling because the program's first cohort start date is in 6 weeks, Chiang said. We have 11 participants confirmed, Doctor. Whitmore has been involved in curriculum design for the past week, which means the diagnostic systems module is now significantly better than it was before she got involved, and also significantly more demanding. A brief pause. She specifically designed the final practicum around a real-world intermittent fault scenario. She would not tell me where she got the case study. I suspect you know. Daniel thought about the cold case files. Cases 3, 5, and 7. The thermal interaction between the BMS and the secondary cooling loop. His 4 pages of handwritten notes. I might know, he said. The cohort needs a peer mentor, Chang said. Not a professor. Not an instructor. Someone who is actively doing the work. Who went through exactly what these 11 people are going through. Who can sit with them when the technical content is hard and when the imposter syndrome is harder, and tell them from experience that both of those things are survivable. He paused. The stipend is modest. The time commitment is about 4 hours a week, remote, with one of the 4 assessment weekends. But what I'm really calling to ask is whether you'd be willing to be that person for this cohort. Daniel stood in the organized equipment room with his phone to his ear and thought about 11 people who had built expertise in garages and workshops and service bays and backyards, people who knew things that nobody had given them credit for knowing, people who had been told in 100 different ways that the credential was the competence, and that without the credential, the competence didn't count. He thought about being 22 years old in a job interview, handing over a resume that showed a high school diploma and 4 years of working in his father's garage, and watching the interviewer's expression, close like a door. Yes, he said, I'll do it. Good, Chang said. I'll send the onboarding documents this afternoon. A pause. And Daniel, for what it's worth, from a career educator who has watched a great many people do a great many things, what you're building right now is not a recovery from an oversight. It's a foundation. Don't let anyone frame it as the former. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Dr. Chang. Robert, Chang said. We're colleagues now. They hung up. Daniel put his phone in his pocket and stood in the clean, organized equipment room and let the word land. Colleagues. He turned it over, once not with disbelief, but with the careful attention of someone receiving something real and wanting to receive it correctly. Then his cart was still sitting by the door, and there was still a morning left, and the building was not going to stop needing attention because he was leaving it in 4 hours. He got back to work. Marie Kowalski was 63 years old and had the handshake of someone who spent decades in physical work and the eyes of someone who had spent the same decades paying attention. She arrived at noon with a lemon card and a hug for Pete that suggested they had been married long enough that the hug was completely unself-conscious. And she turned to Daniel with the direct warmth of a person who does not waste time on social performance. You're taller than I expected, she said. People say that, Daniel said. Pete's been talking about you for a year. You fixed something in the 3rd floor bathroom in October, and whatever you did also fixed a noise the building had been making for 2 years that nobody could identify. He came home and told me about it. Daniel remembered October. The running toilet had been a symptom. The actual issue had been a pressure differential in the building's main supply line. that was creating a resonance in the third-floor plumbing. He'd addressed the source, and the symptom had resolved, along with the 2-year noise that nobody had been able to trace. He'd documented it and moved on. He hadn't known anyone had noticed the noise going away. "Pete noticed," he said. "Pete notices everything," Marie said. "He just doesn't always say it in the building." She handed him an envelope. Inside was a card signed by both of them, and inside the card was a photograph printed, which meant she'd gone to the effort of actually printing it, of the three of them, Daniel and Pete and Gerald. Taken 2 days ago, when Gerald had gathered the maintenance team for a brief, unofficial send-off in the break room. Daniel hadn't known anyone had taken a photo. He looked at it. Pete, Gerald himself, 3 men who worked in a building. 3 men who kept things running in the places that running things required: the corridors nobody walked through, the panels nobody opened, the systems nobody thought about until they stopped working. "Thank you," Daniel said, and he meant it in a way that the 2 words weren't quite big enough for. "The card for Emma is inside," Marie said. "Tell her from me that any girl whose father does what your father does starts out ahead." Daniel held the envelope. Marie Kowalski, who had never met him before noon on a Thursday, who had come in specifically to hand him a card and look him in the eye, turned back to Pete and told him he needed to eat something before his shift ended, which Pete responded to with the patient tolerance of a man who has been told this for 30 years and intends to be told it for 30 more. Daniel watched them and felt something he didn't have a name for, that was somewhere between tenderness and grief and gratitude. The 3-way intersection that opens up sometimes, when you see ordinary people being good to each other with complete sincerity and no audience. He finished his shift at 4 o'clock. He did not make it dramatic. He loaded his personal items into his bag, which amounted to a spare shirt, a small framed photo of his father he'd kept in his locker, and the wrench his father had given him when he was 16, which he'd carried to every job he'd ever had, and which bore no official significance except his own. And he shook Gerald's hand, and Pete's, and nodded to the 2 newer maintenance staff, who'd been there for the send-off Tuesday, and he walked to the front entrance and out through the door. He stood on the sidewalk. The city continued around him, indifferent and enormous and alive, and Daniel Carter stood in the middle of it with a bag on his shoulder, and his father's wrench, and be corn-formed from a woman named Marie, and 4 hours until Emma's bedtime, and he tilted his face up for exactly 3 seconds and breathed. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walked toward the subway. He started at Meridian Technical the following Monday. The first morning was not what he expected, which was exactly what David Meridian had intended. Daniel had anticipated being introduced to the team, given a tour, walked through protocols, onboarded in the standard sequence. Instead, Meridian met him at the door at 8:59 and took him directly to the floor and pointed at a vehicle that 3 members of the diagnostic team had been working on since 7A. "Tell me what they're missing," Meridian said. "Not welcome aboard. Not let me show you around. Straight to the floor." Daniel liked him more for it. He spent 20 minutes with the vehicle while the 3 engineers, all of whom were watching him with the particular mixture of professional skepticism and genuine curiosity that he would come to know well, went around him. Then he stood up and said to the nearest engineer, a woman named Priya who had 7 years of experience and the fastest hands Daniel had ever seen on a diagnostic bench, "The intermittent fault isn't in the motor controller. It's in the torque sensor calibration. The calibration drifted under thermal expansion, which means it's only representing it at operating temperature, which is why the cold start diagnostic is clean." Priya stared at him. "We checked the torque sensor," she said. "At what temperature?" A pause. "Ambient. Check it at 90 degrees Celsius operating temperature," Daniel said. She checked it. She came back 4 minutes later with an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and was not entirely succeeding. "The calibration offset is 0.7%, which is within spec at ambient, but at operating temperature, the expansion in the sensor housing shifts it to 1.4%, which is outside the control threshold." "That's your fault," Daniel said. Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she laughed, not meanly, not defensively, the genuine laugh of someone who has just learned something real and knows it. "How long did it take you to see that?" "About 8 minutes," Daniel said. but I've seen that drift pattern before. In a different system. Once you know the signature, you recognize it. What system? A neighbor's pickup truck, Daniel said. 3 years ago. His check engine light kept coming on and clearing. Took me 2 weekends to find it. Priya blinked. A pickup truck. A 2019 F-150 with an aftermarket cold air intake that changed the thermal behavior of the MAF-AF sensor housing. Daniel said. Different system. Same principle. Calibration drift under thermal expansion. Presenting intermittently, clearing on cold restart. Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to hear about that F-150. Come to my bench at lunch, Daniel said. Bring Priya. And whoever else is working the thermal fault cases. She came. She brought 4 other engineers. They ate at the workbench. And Daniel talked, and they asked questions, real questions. Hard questions. The kind that come from people who are following closely enough to find the gaps. And he answered all of them. And when he didn't know something, he said so. And when the answer came from his father's garage, he said that too. And nobody in that room made him feel, for even a moment, that the origin of the knowledge made it less valid. He drove home that night, feeling something that he had not felt in a professional context since he was 22 years old and working in his father's garage. Before the interviews and the rejections and the 14 months of maintenance carts and flickering corridor lights. He felt like himself. Completely, fully, without apology or adjustment, or the constant low-level management of being somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. Just himself, doing the work he understood, with people who cared about the same things he cared about. He called Emma from the parking lot before he drove home. How was it, she asked. Good, he said. And then, because she would hear the understatement and hold it against him later, really good, Bug. Really good. Did you fix anything? First morning. What was wrong? He explained. She listened with the focused attention of a child who had been handed tools since she was 5 and understood more than she could articulate. When he finished, she said, so it was like how the carburetor in the Buick acts different when it's hot versus when it's cold. He paused. Yes, he said, exactly like that. A satisfied silence on her end. Okay, she said, I saved you dinner. Mrs. Ramirez made a rose con polo. I'll be home in 30 minutes. 25, she said. It's getting cold. He drove home in 23. 6 weeks later, the Northwestern Polytechnic cohort had their first session. Daniel sat in front of his laptop at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, Emma still asleep, coffee in hand, and looked at 11 faces in 11 squares on the screen. An auto body technician from Phoenix, a retired Navy mechanic from Norfolk, a woman from rural Georgia who had spent 12 years maintaining agricultural equipment, a self-taught hybrid specialist from South Chicago who had learned everything he knew from YouTube videos and practice on his own vehicles, a 60-year-old man from Albuquerque who had been repairing motorcycles for 30 years and been turned away from every credentialing program he'd applied to because he didn't have a high school diploma, only a GED. 11 people, 11 versions of the same story told in different voices. Daniel looked at them and did not give a speech. He did not tell them about the Ferrari. He did not tell them about the video or the 80 million views, or Victoria Valentina, or Meridian Technical. He did not tell them his story as a template for what was possible, because he understood, the way his father had always understood, that the danger of someone else's success story is that it can become a ceiling instead of a door if you hold it wrong. He said, tell me what you know. Not what you want me to think you know. What you actually know. The thing you could do with your eyes closed, that someone with a degree couldn't do without a manual. That's where we start. One by one, they told him. It took the full 4 hours. He listened to all of it the same way. He listened to machines completely, without hierarchy, following the pattern, underneath the pattern. And what he heard, across 11 different voices, and 11 different backgrounds, and 11 different decades, of doing the work in the dark without credit, was the same thing. Competence unrecognized, expertise uncredentialed, knowledge, real and hard-won, and absolutely present, sitting in 11 people who had been told in 100 different ways that what they knew didn't count because of where they'd learned it. He listened until the session ended. Then he said, same time next week. Come with your hardest case. The one you couldn't solve or the one you solved that nobody believed you could. Either one. We'll work it together. He closed the laptop. He sat in his quiet kitchen. Through Emma's closed door, he could hear the faint sound of her beginning to wake up, the small movements, the shift in breathing, the eventual thump of her feet hitting the floor that meant she was committing to the day. He got up and started making pancakes. The twist came on a Tuesday morning in the 8th week at Meridian. Priya knocked on the frame of his workspace. He had a workspace now. Not an office, a workspace, which was exactly what he'd asked for, and said, "David wants you in the conference room." The conference room was not where individual conversations happened at Meridian. It was where group conversations happened. Group conversations at 8:17 on a Tuesday morning were unusual. He went around the table. David Meridian, a woman Daniel didn't recognize, and Victoria Valentina. He stopped in the doorway. Victoria looked at him. She had the expression of a person who has prepared for a conversation and is aware that preparedness does not fully account for the reality of the person you're about to have it with. "Sit down, Daniel," Meridian said. He sat. "This is Angela Reyes," Meridian said, indicating the woman Daniel didn't recognize. "She's the executive director of the Advanced Manufacturing Initiative at the Department of Labor." Daniel looked at Angela Reyes, who had the composed, direct bearing of someone who spent her professional life translating between the world of policy and the world of actual work, and had strong opinions about the distance between them. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I've been following your situation with interest since the AutoVision article." She paused. "The Department of Labor is developing a national credential recognition framework for skilled tradespeople, essentially a pathway to recognize demonstrated expertise in technical fields regardless of formal educational background." She paused. "We've been working on this policy framework for 2 years. We've been looking for a pilot industry, and we've been looking for people who represent the problem clearly enough that the policy case makes itself." She looked at him. "Dr. Whitmore suggested you," she said. David Meridian confirmed. "And Victoria Valentina has offered Valentina Motors as the industry pilot partner for the framework." Daniel looked at Victoria. She held his gaze. "I owe you more than an apology," she said. It came out simply, and without performance which he suspected had taken her effort. "I owe you what the industry owes people like you, which is a system that works correctly." She paused. "I can't build that system alone, but I can be part of building it. And I'm asking whether you'll be part of building it too." The room was quiet. Daniel thought about 11 faces on a laptop screen on a Saturday morning. He thought about the 60-year-old man from Albuquerque with the GED and 30 years of motorcycle repair. He thought about the woman from Georgia maintaining agricultural equipment in the heat. He thought about the self-taught hybrid specialist from South Chicago, learning from YouTube videos and doing the work anyway. He thought about his father, who had done the work for 32 years in a garage outside Detroit that nobody outside 40 miles had ever heard of, and who had died without a credential to his name, except the reputation, earned over 3 decades, of a man whose word and whose work you could trust, absolutely. He thought about what his father would say. His father would not say anything immediately. He would wait. He would let the question settle. Then he would say, "Is it the work, Daniel? Or is it the story about the work?" Daniel looked at Angela Reyes, at David Meridian, at Victoria Valentina, who had looked at his boots on a night that felt like a year ago, and drawn a conclusion she had spent the intervening weeks dismantling, piece by piece, with the particular determination of a person who has decided that being wrong is not the end of the story. "It needs to be real," Daniel said. "Not a pilot that generates a press release and then sits in a committee for 3 years. Not a framework that creates a new kind of credential filter instead of removing the old one." He looked at Angela Reyes directly. "The people it's supposed to serve have been promised things before, by companies, by programs, by initiatives. They've learned not to trust the promise until they can see the structure." "That's exactly right," Reyes said, "which is why I need people who will hold us to that standard from the inside. Not advocates, architects." She paused. "The position would be advisory. Part-time, compatible with your work at Meridian. The goal is a functioning framework in 2 years." 2 years, Daniel said. With quarterly assessments, Reyes said, if the framework isn't tracking toward real outcomes at any assessment point, the pilot ends and we go back to the drawing board. With your input on why it failed. He looked at her. That kind of accountability, he said, I can work with. Meridian almost smiled. Victoria said, good. He told Emma that night. Not all of it. She was 9, and she needed dinner and a story and sleep, not a briefing on federal workforce development policy. But he told her the part that was real and simple enough to hold. Remember when I said the new job was about finding why cars aren't working? Yes, she said through a mouthful of macaroni. Now there's also a project about making sure that people who know how to fix things can actually get jobs fixing things. Emma chewed, processed. Like how you couldn't before. Like that. So you're fixing the system, she said. Not just the cars. He looked at his daughter. She had his father's chin and her mother's eyes, and a 9-year-old's absolute unguarded ability to say the true thing plainly, without complication, without the defensive layering that adults build up over years of being misunderstood. Yeah, he said. Exactly that. Okay, she said. She went back to her macaroni. Then, Dad, can we work on the Buick this weekend? Yeah, Bug. We can work on the Buick. I want to do the carburetor. You want to clean the carburetor. I want to do the whole thing, she said. You can watch. Okay, he said. I'll watch. On a Saturday in late November, 3 months after a night when a Ferrari refused to start, and the world briefly noticed a man it had been looking past, Daniel Carter opened the garage door and set up the workbench and laid out the tools in the order his father had always laid them out, largest to smallest, left to right, nothing out of place. Emma stood beside him and looked at the layout and made one adjustment, moving the flathead 2 inches to the right because, she explained, it made more sense to have it closer to the carburetor body. When you were working from the left side. She was right. He didn't tell her she was right immediately. He looked at the adjustment and thought about it. For 3 full seconds, the way his father had always thought about things before confirming them. Good call, he said. She glowed. They worked for 3 hours. She asked questions the whole time, not anxious questions. Not questions that needed reassurance. Just the focused, specific questions of a person learning something real. He answered all of them. When she did something wrong, he showed her why it was wrong, and what the right approach was, without making the wrongness the point. When she did something right, he let the rightness speak for itself. At one point, she dropped a bolt into the engine bay, and they spent 4 minutes finding it together, and when they found it, she held it up with the triumphant expression of someone who has located something genuinely important, because in a garage, the bolt is always genuinely important. Grandpa lost a bolt once, Daniel said. Emma looked at him. What happened? He spent an hour looking for it. Then he found it in his shirt pocket. He paused. He'd been looking with both hands and had no idea how it got there. Emma thought about this. That's really funny. He was not amused, Daniel said. Until later. Then it was one of his favorite stories. Emma smiled. Then she went back to the carburetor. She worked with the careful, deliberate attention of a child who understood that the work deserved her full attention. Daniel watched her hands, her own hands, nobody else's, hers, moving over the components with a growing confidence that was not performance and not pretending. She was learning to listen. He could see it. The slight tilt of her head when a sound was slightly wrong. The way her fingers slowed when something didn't feel seated correctly. The instinct beginning to build, the one that couldn't be taught directly, but could be transmitted from hand to hand, from patience to patience, from one generation's knowledge to the next one's readiness. His father had given it to him. He was giving it to her. And someday, in a garage or a workshop or a diagnostic bay, or somewhere none of them could imagine yet, Emma Carter would put her hand on a machine that wasn't working and feel what was wrong, and she would fix it, and someone would ask her where she learned it, and she would say, from my father, and he learned it from his father. And that was the whole story, really. That was always the whole story. Not the Ferrari, not the video, not the 80 million views or the Auto Vision article or the Department of Labor or the Northwestern Polytechnic cohort or any of the things that had happened in 3 months that had changed the shape of their life. Just this, the garage, the tools in order, the question asked and answered, The knowledge moving from one pair of hands to another across the distance of a generation. That was the thing that couldn't be taken. That was the thing that no credential could give you, and no dismissal could take away. That was what his father had left him, the only inheritance that had ever mattered. And Daniel Carter, 34 years old, single father, diagnostic engineer, mentor, architect of a framework that might change the way the country understood competence, stood in his garage on a Saturday morning and watched his daughter's hands, and understood, with the full weight of everything the last 3 months had taught him, that the work had never been about recognition. It had been about legacy, the quiet, stubborn, unbreakable transfer of something true from one generation to the next. His father had started it. He was carrying it. Emma would carry it further than either of them could see. And a Ferrari that refused to start on one particular night in Manhattan had simply been the moment the world looked up long enough to notice that the carrying had been happening all along. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.